This is Manon Lescaut by Abbé Prévost, a work now in the public domain. V. By and Bienation. Infected with that leprosy of lust, which taints the hoariest years of vicious men, making them ransack, to the very last, the dregs of pleasure for their vanished joys. Byron. On sitting down to reflect upon this strange turn of fate, I found myself so perplexed, and consequently so incapable of arriving at any rational conclusion, that I allowed Lescaut to put repeated questions to me without in the slightest degree attending to their purport. It was then that honour and virtue made me feel the most poignant remorse, and that I recalled with bitterness Amiens, my father's house, Saint-Sulpice, and every spot where I had ever lived in happy innocence. By what a terrific interval was I now separated from that blessed state! I beheld it no longer, but as a dim shadow in the distance, still attracting my regrets and desires, but without the power of rousing me to exertion. By what fatality, said I, have I become thus degraded? Love is not a guilty passion. Why then has it been to me the source of profligacy and distress? Who prevented me from leading a virtuous and tranquil life with Manon? Why did I not marry her before I obtained any concession from her love? Would not my father, who had the tenderest regard for me, have given his consent if I had taken the fair and candid course of soliciting him? Yes, my father would himself have cherished her as one far too good to be his son's wife. I should have been happy in the love of Manon, in the affection of my father, in the esteem of the world, with a moderate portion of the good things of life, and above all with the consciousness of virtue. Disastrous change, into what an infamous character is it here proposed that I should sink? To share, but can I hesitate if Manon herself suggests it, and if I am to lose her except upon such conditions? Lescaut, said I, putting my hands to my eyes as if to shut out such a horrifying vision, if your intention was to render me a service, I give you thanks. You might perhaps have struck out a more reputable course, but it is so settled, is it not? Let us then only think of profiting by your labour and fulfilling your engagements. Lescaut, who had been considerably embarrassed, not only by my fury, but by the long silence which followed it, was too happy to see me now take a course so different from what he had anticipated. He had not a particle of courage, of which indeed I have, in the sequel of my story, abundant proof. Yes, yes, he quickly answered, it is good service I have rendered you, and you will find that we shall derive infinitely more advantage from it than you now expect. We consulted then as to the best mode of preventing the suspicions which G.M.N. might entertain of our relationship when he found me older and of riper manhood than he probably imagined. The only plan we could hit upon was to assume in his presence an innocent and provincial air, and to persuade him that it was my intention to enter the church, and that with that view I was obliged to go every day to the college. We also determined that I should appear as awkward as I possibly could the first time I was admitted to the honour of an introduction. He returned to town 3 or 4 days after, and at once conducted Manon to the house which his steward had in the meantime prepared. She immediately apprised Lescaut of her return, and he, having informed me, we went together to her new abode. The old lover had already gone out. In spite of the submission with which I had resigned myself to her wishes, I could not, at our meeting, repress the compunctious visitings of my conscience. I appeared before her grieved and dejected. The joy I felt at seeing her once more could not altogether dispel my sorrow for her infidelity. She, on the contrary, appeared transported with the pleasure of seeing me. She accused me of coldness. I could not help muttering the words perfidious and unfaithful, though they were profusely mixed with sighs. At first she laughed at me for my simplicity, but when she found that I continued to look at her with an unchanging expression of melancholy, and that I could not bring myself to enter with alacrity into a scene so repugnant to all my feelings, she went alone into her boudoir. I very soon followed her, and then I found her in a flood of tears. I asked the cause of her sorrow. "You can easily understand it," said she. "How can you wish me to live, if my presence can no longer have any other effect than to give you an air of sadness and chagrin? Not one kiss have you given me during the long hour you have been in the house, while you have received my caresses with the dignified indifference of a Grand Turk, receiving the forced homage of the sultanas of his harem. Hearken to me, Manon," said I, embracing her. "I cannot conceal from you that my heart is bitterly afflicted. I do not now allude to the uneasiness your sudden flight caused me, nor to the unkindness of quitting me without a word of consolation, after having passed the night away from me. The pleasure of seeing you again would more than compensate for all. But do you imagine that I can reflect without sighs and tears upon the degrading and unhappy life which you now wish me to lead in this house? Say nothing of my birth, or of my feelings of honour. Love like mine derives no aid from arguments of that feeble nature. But do you imagine that I can, without emotion, see my love so badly recompensed, or rather so cruelly treated, by an ungrateful and unfeeling mistress? She interrupted me. "Stop, Chevalier," said she. "It is useless to torture me with reproaches, which, coming from you, always pierce my heart. I see what annoys you. I had hoped that you would have agreed to the project which I had devised for mending our shattered fortunes, and it was from a feeling of delicacy to you that I began the execution of it without your assistance, but I give it up since it does not meet your approbation." She added that she would now merely request a little patient forbearance during the remainder of the day, that she had already received 500 crowns from the old gentleman, and that he had promised to bring her that evening a magnificent pearl necklace with other jewels, and, in advance, half of the yearly pension he had engaged to allow her. "Leave me only time enough," said she to me, "to get possession of these presents. I promise you that he will have little to boast of from his connection with me, for in the country I repulsed all his advances, putting him off till I returned to town. It is true that he has kissed my hand 1,000 times over, and it is but just that he should pay for even this amusement. I am sure that, considering his riches as well as his age, 5,000 or 6,000 francs is not an unreasonable price." Her determination was of more value in my eyes than 20,000 crowns. I could feel that I was not yet bereft of every sentiment of honour by the satisfaction I experienced at escaping thus from infamy, but I was born for brief joys and miseries of long duration. Fate never rescued me from one precipice, but to lead me to another. When I had expressed my delight to Manon at this change in her intentions, I told her she had better inform Lescaut of it, in order that we might take our measures in concert. At first he murmured, but the money in hand induced him to enter into our views. It was then determined that we should all meet at G.M.M.'s supper table, and that for 2 reasons. First, for the amusement of passing me off as a schoolboy and brother to Manon, and secondly, to prevent the old profligate from taking any liberties with his mistress on the strength of his liberal payments in advance. Lescaut and I were to retire when he went to the room where he expected to pass the night, and Manon, instead of following him, promised to come out and join us. Lescaut undertook to have a coach waiting at the door. The supper hour having arrived, Mem G made his appearance. Already Lescaut was with his sister in the supper room. The moment the lover entered, he presented his fair one with a complete set of pearls, necklaces, earrings, and bracelets, which must have cost at least 1,000 crowns. He then placed on the table before her, in louis d'or, 2,400 francs, the half of her year's allowance. He seasoned his present with many pretty speeches in the true style of the old court. Manon could not refuse him a few kisses. It was sealing her right to the money which he had just handed to her. I was at the door, and waiting for Lescaut's signal to enter the room. He approached to take me by the hand, while Manon was securing the money and jewels, and leading me towards Money. G.M.M. He desired me to make my bow. I made 2 or 3 most profound ones. "Pray excuse him, sir," said Lescaut. "He is a mere child. He has not yet acquired much of the ton of Paris, but no doubt with a little trouble we shall improve him. You will often have the honour of seeing that gentleman. Here," said he, turning towards me, "take advantage of it, and endeavour to imitate so good a model." The old libertine appeared to be pleased with me. He patted me on the cheek, saying that I was a fine boy, but that I should be on my guard in Paris, where young men were easily debauched. Lescaut assured him that I was naturally of so grave a character that I thought of nothing but becoming a clergyman, and that, even as a child, my favourite amusement was building little chapels. "I fancy a likeness to Manon," said the old gentleman, putting his hand under my chin. I answered him with the most simple air. "Sir, the fact is that we are very closely connected, and I love my sister as another portion of myself." "Do you hear that?" said he to Lescaut. "He is indeed a clever boy. It is a pity he should not see something of the world." "Oh, sir," I replied, "I have seen a great deal of it at home, attending church, and I believe I might find in Paris some greater fools than myself." "Listen," said he, "it is positively wonderful in a boy from the country." The whole conversation during supper was of the same kind. Manon, with her usual gaiety, was several times on the point of spoiling the joke by her bursts of laughter. I contrived, while eating, to recount his own identical history and to paint even the fate that awaited him. Lescaut and Manon were in an agony of fear during my recital, especially while I was drawing his portrait to the life. But his own vanity prevented him from recognizing it, and I did it so well that he was the first to pronounce it extremely laughable. You will allow that I had reason for dwelling on this ridiculous scene. At length it was time to retire. He hinted at the impatience of love. Lescaut and I took our departure. G.M.M. went to his room, and Manon, making some excuse for her absence, came to join us at the gate. The coach, that was waiting for us a few doors off, drove up towards us, and we were out of the street in an instant. Although I must confess that this proceeding appeared to me little short of actual robbery, it was not the most dishonest one with which I thought I had to reproach myself. I had more scruples about the money which I had won at play. However, we derived as little advantage from one as from the other, and heaven sometimes ordains that the lightest fault shall meet the severest punishment. G. was not long in finding out that he had been duped. I am not sure whether he took any steps that night to discover us, but he had influence enough to ensure an effectual pursuit, and we were sufficiently imprudent to rely upon the extent of Paris and the distance between our residence and his. Not only did he discover our abode and our circumstances, but also who I was. The life that I had led in Paris, Manon's former connection with B, the manner in which she had deceived him, in a word, all the scandalous facts of our history. He therefore resolved to have us apprehended and treated less as criminals than as vagabonds. An officer came abruptly one morning into our bedroom with 6 archers of the guard. They first took possession of our money, or I should rather say of G.M.M. They made us quickly get up and conducted us to the door, where we found 2 coaches, into one of which they forced poor Manon without any explanation, and I was taken in the other to Saint-Lazare. One must have experienced this kind of reverse to understand the despair that is caused by it. The police was savage enough to deny me the consolation of embracing Manon or of bidding her farewell. I remained for a long time ignorant of her fate. It was perhaps fortunate for me that I was kept in a state of ignorance, for had I known what she suffered, I should have lost my senses, probably my life. My unhappy mistress was dragged then from my presence and taken to a place the very name of which fills me with horror to remember. This to be the lot of a creature the most perfect, who must have shared the most splendid throne on earth, if other men had only seen and felt as I did. She was not treated harshly there, but was shut up in a narrow prison, and obliged, in solitary confinement, to perform a certain quantity of work each day, as a necessary condition for obtaining the most unpalatable food. I did not learn this till a long time after, when I had myself endured some months of rough and cruel treatment. My guards not having told me where it was that they had been ordered to conduct me, it was only on my arrival at Saint-Lazare that I learned my destination. I would have preferred death at that moment to the state into which I believed myself about to be thrown. I had the utmost terror of this place. My misery was increased by the guards on my entrance, examining once more my pockets, to ascertain whether I had about me any arms or weapons of defence. My governor appeared. He had been informed of my apprehension. He saluted me with great mildness. "Do not, my good sir," said I to him, "allow me to be treated with indignity. I would suffer 100 deaths rather than quietly submit to degrading treatment." "No, no," he replied, "you will act quietly and prudently, and we shall be mutually content with each other." He begged of me to ascend to one of the highest rooms. I followed him without a murmur. The archers accompanied us to the door, and the governor, entering the room, made a sign for them to depart. "I am your prisoner, I suppose," said I. "Well, what do you intend to do with me?" he said. He was delighted to see me adopt so reasonable a tone, that it would be his duty to endeavour to inspire me with a taste for virtue and religion, and mine to profit by his exhortations and advice, that lightly as I might be disposed to rate his attentions to me, I should find nothing but enjoyment in my solitude. "Ah, enjoyment indeed," replied I. "You do not know, my good sir, the only thing on earth that could afford me enjoyment." "I know it," said he, "but I trust your inclinations will change." His answer showed that he had heard of my adventures, and perhaps of my name. I begged to know if such were the fact. He told me candidly that they had informed him of every particular. This blow was the severest of any I had yet experienced. I literally shed a torrent of tears, in all the bitterness of unmixed despair. I could not reconcile myself to the humiliation which would make me a proverb to all my acquaintances and the disgrace of my family. I passed a week in the most profound dejection, without being capable of gaining any information or of occupying myself with anything but my own degradation. The remembrance even of Manon added nothing to my grief. It only occurred to me as a circumstance that had preceded my new sorrow, and the sense of shame and confusion was at present the all-absorbing passion. There are few persons who have experienced the force of these special workings of the mind. The generality of men are only sensible of 5 or 6 passions, in the limited round of which they pass their lives, and within which all their agitations are confined. Remove them from the influence of love and hate, pleasure and pain, hope and fear, and they have no further feeling. But persons of a finer caste can be affected in 1,000 different ways. It would almost seem that they had more than 5 senses, and that they are accessible to ideas and sensations which far exceed the ordinary faculties of human nature, and, conscious that they possess a capacity which raises them above the common herd, there is nothing of which they are more jealous. Hence springs their impatience under contempt and ridicule, and hence it is that a sense of debasement is perhaps the most violent of all their emotions. I had this melancholy advantage at Saint-Lazare. My grief appeared to the governor so excessive that, dreading the consequences, he thought he was bound to treat me with more mildness and indulgence. He visited me 2 or 3 times a day. He often made me take a turn with him in the garden, and showed his interest for me in his exhortations and good advice. I listened always attentively, and warmly expressed my sense of his kindness, from which he derived hopes of my ultimate conversion. "You appear to me," said he one day, "of a disposition so mild and tractable that I cannot comprehend the excesses into which you have fallen. 2 things astonish me. One is, how, with your good qualities, you could have ever abandoned yourself to vice, and the other, which amazes me still more, is, how you can receive with such perfect temper my advice and instructions after having lived so long in a course of debauchery. If it be sincere repentance, you present a singular example of the benign mercy of heaven. If it proceed from the natural goodness of your disposition, then you certainly have that within you which warrants the hope that a protracted residence in this place will not be required to bring you back to a regular and respectable life." I was delighted to find that he had such an opinion of me. I resolved to strengthen it by a continuance of good conduct, convinced that it was the surest means of abridging the term of my confinement. I begged of him to furnish me with books. He was agreeably surprised to find that when he requested me to say what I should prefer, I mentioned only some religious and instructive works. I pretended to devote myself assiduously to study, and I thus gave him convincing proof of the moral reformation he was so anxious to bring about. It was nothing, however, but rank hypocrisy. I blush to confess it. Instead of studying, when alone I did nothing but curse my destiny. I lavished the bitterest execrations on my prison and the tyrants who detained me there. If I ceased for a moment from these lamentations, it was only to relapse into the tormenting remembrance of my fatal and unhappy love. Manon's absence, the mystery in which her fate was veiled, the dread of never again beholding her, these formed the subject of my melancholy thoughts. I fancied her in the arms of G.M.M. Far from imagining that he could have been brute enough to subject her to the same treatment to which I was condemned, I felt persuaded that he had only procured my removal, in order that he might possess her in undisturbed enjoyment. Oh, how miserable were the days and nights I thus passed! They seemed to be of endless duration. My only hope of escape now was in hypocrisy. I scrutinized the countenance, and carefully marked every observation that fell from the governor, in order to ascertain what he really thought of me, and looking on him as the sole arbiter of my future fate, I made it my study to win, if possible, his favour. I soon had the satisfaction to find that I was firmly established in his good graces, and no longer doubted his disposition to befriend me. I, one day, ventured to ask him whether my liberation depended on him. He replied that it was not altogether in his hands, but that he had no doubt that on his representation, M.A. G.M.M., at whose instance the Lieutenant General of Police had ordered me to be confined, would consent to my being set at liberty. "May I flatter myself," rejoined I, in the mildest tone, "that he will consider 2 months, which I have now spent in this prison, as a sufficient atonement?" He offered to speak to him if I wished it. I implored him without delay to do me that favour. He told me 2 days afterwards that G.M.M. was so sensibly affected by what he had heard, that he not only was ready to consent to my liberation, but that he had even expressed a strong desire to become better acquainted with me, and that he himself purposed to pay me a visit in prison. Although his presence could not afford me much pleasure, I looked upon it as a certain prelude to my liberation. He accordingly came to St. Lazare. I met him with an air more grave and certainly less silly than I had exhibited at his house with Manon. He spoke reasonably enough of my former bad conduct. He added, as if to excuse his own delinquencies, that it was graciously permitted to the weakness of man to indulge in certain pleasures, almost, indeed, prompted by nature, but that dishonesty in such shameful practices ought to be, and always would be, inexorably punished. I listened to all he said with an air of submission, which quite charmed him. I betrayed no symptoms of annoyance even at some jokes in which he indulged about my relationship with Manon and Lescaut, and about the little chapels of which he supposed I must have had time to erect a great many in St. as I was so fond of that occupation. But he happened, unluckily both for me and for himself, to add that he hoped Manon had also employed herself in the same edifying manner at the Magdalen. Notwithstanding the thrill of horror I felt at the sound of the name, I had still presence of mind enough to beg, in the gentlest manner, that he would explain himself. "Oh, yes," he replied, "she has been these last 2 months at the Magdalen learning to be prudent, and I trust she has improved herself as much there as you have done at Saint-Lazare." If an eternal imprisonment, or death itself, had been presented to my view, I could not have restrained the excitement into which this afflicting announcement threw me. I flung myself upon him in so violent a rage that half my strength was exhausted by the effort. I had, however, more than enough left to drag him to the ground and grasp him by the throat. I should infallibly have strangled him if his fall, and the half-stifled cries which he had still the power to utter, had not attracted the governor and several of the priests to my room. They rescued him from my fury. I was myself breathless and almost impotent from rage. "Oh God!" I cried. "Heavenly justice! Must I survive this infamy?" I tried again to seize the barbarian who had thus roused my indignation. They prevented me. My despair, my cries, my tears exceeded all belief. I raved in so incoherent a manner that all the bystanders who were ignorant of the cause looked at each other with as much dread as surprise. G.M.M. in the meantime adjusted his wig and cravat, and in his anger at having been so ill-treated, ordered me to be kept under more severe restraint than before, and to be punished in the manner usual with offenders in Saint-Lazare. "No, sir," said the governor. "It is not with a person of his birth that we are in the habit of using such means of coercion. Besides, he is habitually so mild and well conducted that I cannot but think you must have given provocation for such excessive violence." This reply disconcerted G.M.M. beyond measure, and he went away, declaring that he knew how to be revenged on the governor as well as on me, and everyone else who dared to thwart him. The superior, having ordered some of the brotherhood to escort him out of the prison, remained alone with me. He conjured me to tell him at once what was the cause of the fracas. "Oh, my good sir," said I to him, continuing to cry like a child, "imagine the most horrible cruelty, figure to yourself the most inhuman of atrocities. That is what G.M.M. has had the cowardly baseness to perpetrate. He has pierced my heart. Never shall I recover from this blow. I would gladly tell you the whole circumstance," added I, sobbing with grief. "You are kind-hearted, and cannot fail to pity me." I gave him, as briefly as I could, a history of my long-standing and insurmountable passion for Manon, of the flourishing condition of our fortunes previous to the robbery committed by our servants, of the offers which G.M.M. had made to my mistress, of the understanding they had come to, and the manner in which it had been defeated. To be sure, I represented things to him in as favourable a light for us as possible. "Now you can comprehend," continued I, "the source of M.G.M.M.'s holy zeal for my conversion. He has had influence enough to have me shut up here out of mere revenge, that I can pardon, but, my good sir, that is not all. He has taken from me my heart's blood. He has had Manon shamefully incarcerated in the Magdalen, and had the effrontery to announce it to me this day with his own lips." "In the Magdalen, good sir? Oh, heavens! My adorable mistress, my beloved Manon, a degraded inmate of the hospital. How shall I command strength of mind enough to survive this grief and shame?" The good father, seeing me in such affliction, endeavoured to console me. He told me that he had never understood my history, as I just now related it. He had of course known that I led a dissolute life, but he had imagined that G.M.M.'s interest about me was the result of his esteem and friendship for my family, that it was in this sense he had explained the matter to him, that what I had now told him should assuredly produce a change in my treatment, and that he had no doubt but the accurate detail which he should immediately transmit to the Lieutenant General of Police would bring about my liberation. He then inquired why I had never thought of informing my family of what had taken place, since they had not been instrumental to my incarceration. I satisfactorily answered this by stating my unwillingness to cause my father pain, or to bring upon myself the humiliation of such an exposure. In the end, he promised to go directly to the Lieutenant General of Police, if it were only, said he, to be beforehand with G.M., who went off in such a rage, and who had sufficient influence to make himself formidable. I looked for the good father's return with all the suspense of a man expecting sentence of death. It was torture to me to think of Manon at the Magdalen. Besides the infamy of such a prison, I knew not how she might be treated there, and the recollection of some particulars I had formerly heard of this horrible place incessantly renewed my misery. Cost what it might, I was so bent upon relieving her by some means or other that I should assuredly have set fire to St. Lazare if no other mode of escape had presented itself. I considered what chances would remain to me if the Lieutenant General still kept me in confinement. I taxed my ingenuity, I scanned every imaginable gleam of hope. I could discover nothing that gave me any prospect of escape, and I feared that I should experience only more rigid confinement if I made an unsuccessful attempt. I thought of some friends from whom I might hope for aid, but then, how was I to make them aware of my situation? At length I fancied that I had hit upon a plan so ingenious as to offer a fair probability of success. I postponed the details of its arrangement until after the Superior's return, in case of his having failed in the object of his visit. He soon arrived. I did not observe upon his countenance any of those marks of joy that indicate good news. "I have spoken," said he, "to the Lieutenant General of Police, but I was too late, Mioji. MDAM went straight to him after quitting us, and so prejudiced him against you that he was on the point of sending me fresh instructions to subject you to closer confinement. However, when I let him know the truth of your story, he reconsidered the matter, and, smiling at the incontinence of old GMM, he said it would be necessary to keep you here for 6 months longer, in order to pacify him, the less to be lamented, he added, because your morals would be sure to benefit by your residence here. He desired that I would show you every kindness and attention, and I need not assure you that you shall have no reason to complain of your treatment." This speech of the superior's was long enough to afford me time to form a prudent resolution. I saw that by betraying too strong an impatience for my liberty, I should probably be upsetting all my projects. I acknowledged to him that, as it was necessary to me to remain, it was an infinite comfort to know that I possessed a place in his esteem. I then requested, and with unaffected sincerity, a favour, which could be of no consequence to others, and which would contribute much to my peace of mind. It was to inform a friend of mine, a devout clergyman who lived at Saint-Sulpice, that I was at St. Lazare, and to permit me occasionally to receive his visits. This was of course my friend Théberge, not that I could hope from him the assistance necessary for effecting my liberty, but I wished to make him the unconscious instrument of my designs. In a word, this was my project. I wished to write to Lescaut, and to charge him and our common friends with the task of my deliverance. The first difficulty was to have my letter conveyed to him. This should be Théberge's office. However, as he knew him to be Manon's brother, I doubted whether he would take charge of this commission. My plan was to enclose my letter to Lescaut in another to some respectable man of my acquaintance, begging of him to transmit the first to its address without delay, and as it was necessary that I should have personal communication with Lescaut in order to arrange our proceedings, I told him to call on me at St. Lazare and assume the name of my eldest brother, as if he had come to Paris expressly to see me. I postponed till our meeting all mention of the safest and most expeditious course I intended to suggest for our future conduct. The governor informed Théberge of my wish to see him. This ever-faithful friend had not so entirely lost sight of me as to be ignorant of my present abode, and it is probable that, in his heart, he did not regret the circumstance, from an idea that it might furnish the means of my moral regeneration. He lost no time in paying me the desired visit. VI. It is a strange thing to note the excess of this passion, and how it braves the nature and value of things by this, that the speaking in a perpetual hyperbole is comely in nothing but in love. Bacon. My interview with Théberge was of the most friendly description. I saw that his object was to discover the present temper of my mind. I opened my heart to him without any reserve, except as to the mere point of my intention of escaping. "It is not from such a friend as you," said I, "that I can ever wish to dissemble my real feelings. If you flattered yourself with the hope that you were at last about to find me grown prudent and regular in my conduct, a libertine reclaimed by the chastisements of fortune, released alike from the trammels of love and the dominion that Manon wields over me, I must in candour say that you deceive yourself. You still behold me, as you left me 4 months ago, the slave, if you will, the unhappy slave, of a passion from which I now hope, as fervently and as confidently as I ever did, to derive eventually solid comfort. He answered that such an acknowledgment rendered me utterly inexcusable, that it was no uncommon case to meet sinners who allowed themselves to be so dazzled with the glare of vice as to prefer it openly to the true splendour of virtue. They were at least deluded by the false image of happiness, and the poor dupes of an empty shadow, but to know and feel as I did that the object of my attachment was only calculated to render me culpable and unhappy, and to continue thus voluntarily in a career of misery and crime, involved a contradiction of ideas and of conduct little creditable to my reason. Tyberge, replied I, it is easy to triumph when your arguments are unopposed. Allow me to reason for a few moments in my turn. Can you pretend that what you call the happiness of virtue is exempt from troubles and crosses and cares? By what name will you designate the dungeon, the rack, the inflections and tortures of tyrants? Will you say with the mystics that the soul derives pleasure from the torments of the body? You are not bold enough to hold such a doctrine. A paradox not to be maintained. This happiness, then, that you prize so much, has 1,000 drawbacks, or is, more properly speaking, but a tissue of sufferings through which one hopes to attain felicity. If by the power of imagination one can even derive pleasure from these sufferings, hoping that they may lead to a happy end, why, let me ask, do you deem my conduct senseless when it is directed by precisely the same principle? I love Manon. I wade through sorrow and suffering in order to attain happiness with her. My path is one indeed of difficulties, but the mere hope of reaching the desired goal makes it easy and delightful, and I shall think myself but too bountifully repaid by one moment of her society for all the troubles I encounter in my course. There appears therefore no difference between us, or, if there be any, it is assuredly in my favour, for the bliss I hope for is near and tangible, yours is far distant and purely speculative. Mine is of the same kind as my sufferings, that is to say, evident to my senses. Yours is of an incomprehensible nature, and only discernible through the dim medium of faith. Tyberge appeared shocked by my remarks. He retired 2 or 3 paces from me, while he said, in the most serious tone, that my argument was not only a violation of good sense, but that it was the miserable sophistry of irreligion. For the comparison, he added, of the pitiful reward of your sufferings with that held out to us by the divine revelation is the essence of impiety and absurdity combined. I acknowledge, said I, that the comparison is not a just one, but my argument does not at all depend upon it. I was about to explain what you consider a contradiction, the persevering in a painful pursuit, and I think I have satisfactorily proved that if there be any contradiction in that, we shall be both equally obnoxious to the charge. It was in this light, only, that I could observe no difference in our cases, and I cannot as yet perceive any. You may probably answer that the proposed end, the promised reward of virtue, is infinitely superior to that of love. No one disputes it, but that is not the question. We are only discussing the relative aid they both afford in the endurance of affliction. Judge of that by the practical effect. Are there not multitudes who abandon a life of strict virtue? How few give up the pursuits of love? Again, you will reply that if there be difficulties in the exercise of virtue, they are by no means universal and sure, that the good man does not necessarily meet tyrants and tortures, and that, on the contrary, a life of virtue is perfectly compatible with repose and enjoyment. I can say with equal truth that love is often accompanied by content and happiness, and what makes another distinction of infinite advantage to my argument. I may add that love, though it often deludes, never holds out other than hopes of bliss and joy, whilst religion exacts from her votaries mortification and sorrow. Do not be alarmed, said I, perceiving that I had almost offended his zealous feelings of devotion. I only wish to say that there is no more unsuccessful method of weaning man's heart from love than by endeavouring to decry its enjoyments, and by promising him more pleasure from the exercise of virtue. It is an inherent principle in our nature that our felicity consists only in pleasure. I defy you to conceive any other notion of it, and it requires little time to arrive at the conviction that, of all pleasures, those of love are immeasurably the most enchanting. A man quickly discerns the delusion when he hears the promise made of livelier enjoyment, and the effect of such misrepresentation is only to make him doubt the truth of a more solid promise. Let the preacher who seeks the reformation of a sinner tell me that virtue is indispensably necessary, but not disguise its difficulty and its attendant denials. Say that the enjoyments of love are fleeting, if you will, that they are rigidly forbidden, that they lead with certainty to eternal suffering. And, what would assuredly make a deeper impression upon me than any other argument, say that the more sweet and delectable they are, the brighter will be the reward of heaven for giving them up in sacrifice, but do in the name of justice admit that constituted as the heart of man is, they form here, on earth, our most perfect happiness. My last sentence restored to Tyberg his good humour. He allowed that my ideas were not altogether so unreasonable. The only point he made was in asking me why I did not carry my own principle into operation by sacrificing my passion to the hope of that remuneration of which I had drawn so brilliant a picture. "Oh, my dear friend," replied I, "that it is which makes me conscious of my own misery and weakness. True, alas, it is indeed my duty to act according to my argument, but have I the power of governing my own actions? What aid will enable me to forget Manon's charms?" "God forgive me," said Tyberg, "I can almost fancy you a Jansenist." "I know not of what sect I am," replied I, "nor do I indeed very clearly see to which I ought to belong, but I cannot help feeling the truth of this, at least of their tenets." One effect of our conversation was to revive my friend's pity for me in all its force. He perceived that there was in my errors more of weakness than of vice, and he was the more disposed in the end to give me assistance, without which I should infallibly have perished from distress of mind. However, I carefully concealed from him my intention of escaping from Stistelazar. I merely begged of him to take charge of my letter. I had it ready before he came, and I soon found an excuse for the necessity of writing. He faithfully transmitted it, and Lescaut received before evening the one I had enclosed for him. He came to see me next morning, and fortunately was admitted under my brother's name. I was overjoyed at finding him in my room. I carefully closed the door. "Let us lose no time," I said. "First tell me about Manon, and then advise me how I am to shake off these fetters." He assured me that he had not seen his sister since the day before my arrest, and that it was only by repeated inquiries, and after much trouble, that he had at length been able to discover her fate as well as mine, and that he had 2 or 3 times presented himself at the Magdalen, and been refused admittance. "Wretch," muttered I to myself, "dearly shall GMM pay for this." "As to your escape," continued Lescaut, "it will not be so easy as you imagine. Last evening I and a couple of friends walked round this establishment to reconnoitre it, and we agreed that, as your windows looked into a court surrounded by buildings, as you yourself mentioned in your letter, there would be vast difficulty in getting you out. Besides, you are on the 3rd story, and it would be impossible to introduce ropes or ladders through the window. I therefore see no means from without. In the house itself we must hit upon some scheme." "No," replied I have examined everything minutely, particularly since, through the governor's indulgence, my confinement has been less rigorous. I am no longer locked into my room. I have liberty to walk in the gallery, but there is, upon every landing, a strong door kept closed night and day, so that it is impossible that ingenuity alone, unaided by some violent efforts, can rescue me." "Wait," said I, after turning in my mind for a moment an idea that struck me as excellent. "Could you bring me a pistol?" "Softly," said Lescaut to me, "you don't think of committing murder?" I assured him that I had so little intention of shooting anyone that it would not be even necessary to have the pistol loaded. "Bring it to me tomorrow," I added, "and do not fail to be exactly opposite the great entrance with 2 or 3 of your friends at 11 tomorrow night. I think I shall be able to join you there." He in vain requested me to explain my plan. I told him that such an attempt as I contemplated could only appear rational after it had succeeded. I begged of him to shorten his visit, in order that he might with the less difficulty be admitted next morning. He was accordingly admitted as readily as on his first visit. He had put on so serious an air, moreover, that a stranger would have taken him for a respectable person. When I found in my hand the instrument of my liberty, I no longer doubted my success. It was certainly a strange and a bold project, but of what was I not capable, with the motives that inspired me? I had, since I was allowed permission to walk in the galleries, found opportunities of observing that every night the porter brought the keys of all the doors to the governor, and subsequently there always reigned a profound silence in the house, which showed that the inmates had retired to rest. There was an open communication between my room and that of the superior. My resolution was, if he refused quietly to surrender the keys, to force him, by fear of the pistol, to deliver them up, and then by their help to gain the street. I impatiently awaited the moment for executing my purpose. When the porter arrived at his usual time, that is to say, soon after 9 o'clock, I allowed an hour to elapse in order that the priests as well as the servants might be all asleep. I, at length, proceeded with my pistol and a lighted candle. I first gave a gentle tap at the governor's door to awaken without alarming him. I knocked a second time before he heard me, and supposing of course that it was one of the priests who was taken ill and wanted assistance, he got out of bed, dressed himself, and came to the door. He had, however, the precaution to ask first who it was and what was wanted. I was obliged to mention my name, but I assumed a plaintive tone, to make him believe that I was indisposed. Ah, it is you, my dear boy," said he on opening the door. "What can bring you here at this hour?" I stepped inside the door, and leading him to the opposite side of the room, I declared to him that it was absolutely impossible for me to remain longer at Saint-Lazare, that the night was the most favourable time for going out unobserved, and that I confidently expected, from his tried friendship, that he would consent to open the gates for me, or entrust me with the keys to let myself out. This compliment to his friendship seemed to surprise him. He stood for a few moments looking at me without making any reply. Finding that I had no time to lose, I just begged to assure him that I had the most lively sense of all his kindnesses, but that freedom was dearer to man than every other consideration, especially so to me, who had been cruelly and unjustly deprived of it, that I was resolved this night to recover it, cost what it would, and fearing lest he might raise his voice and call for assistance, I let him see the powerful incentive to silence which I had kept concealed in my bosom. "A pistol!" cried he. "What, my son? Will you take away my life in return for the attentions I have shown you?" "God forbid," replied I. "You are too reasonable to drive me to that horrible extremity, but I am determined to be free, and so firmly determined that if you defeat my project, I will put an end to your existence." "But, my dear son," said he, pale and frightened, "what have I done to you? What reason have you for taking my life?" "No," replied I, impatiently, "I have no design upon your life if you, yourself, wish to live. Open but the doors for me, and you will find me the most attached of friends." I perceived the keys upon the table. I requested he would take them in his hand and walk before me, making as little noise as he possibly could. He saw the necessity of consenting. We proceeded, and as he opened each door, he repeated, always with a sigh, "Ah, my son, who could have believed it? No noise, good father, no noise." I as often answered in my turn. At length we reached a kind of barrier just inside the great entrance. I already fancied myself free, and kept close behind the governor, with my candle in one hand and my pistol in the other. While he was endeavouring to open the heavy gate, one of the servants, who slept in an adjoining room, hearing the noise of the bolts, jumped out of bed and peeped forth to see what was passing. My good father apparently thought him strong enough to overpower me. He commanded him, most imprudently, to come to his assistance. He was a powerful ruffian, and threw himself upon me without an instant's hesitation. There was no time for parleying. I levelled my pistol, and lodged the contents in his breast. "See, father, of what mischief you have been the cause," said I to my guide. "But that must not prevent us from finishing our work," I added, pushing him on towards the last door. He did not dare refuse to open it. I made my exit in perfect safety, and, a few paces off, found Lescaut with 2 friends waiting for me, according to his promise. We removed at once to a distance. Lescaut inquired whether he had not heard the report of a pistol. "You are to blame," said I. "Why did you bring it charged?" I, however, could not help thanking him for having taken this precaution, without which I doubtless must have continued much longer at Saint-Lazare. We went to pass the night at a tavern, where I made up, in some degree, for the miserable fare which had been doled out to me for nearly 3 months. I was very far, however, from tasting perfect enjoyment. Manon's sufferings were mine. "She must be released," said I to my companions. "This was my sole object in desiring my own liberty. I rely on your aiding me with all your ingenuity. As for myself, my life shall be devoted to the purpose." Lescaut, who was not deficient in tact, and still less in that better part of valour called discretion, dwelt upon the necessity of acting with extreme caution. He said that my escape from Ston-les-Arts and the accident that happened on my leaving it would assuredly create a sensation, that the Lieutenant General of Police would cause a strict search to be made for me, and it would be difficult to evade him, in fine, that, unless disposed to encounter something worse perhaps than Ceyce-les-Arts, it would be requisite for me to remain concealed for a few days in order to give the enemy's zeal time to cool. No doubt this was wise counsel, but one should have been wise oneself to have followed it. Such calculating slowness little suited my passion. The utmost I could bring myself to promise was that I would sleep through the whole of the next day. He locked me in my bedroom, where I remained patiently until night. I employed great part of the time in devising schemes for relieving Manon. I felt persuaded that her prison was even more inaccessible than mine had been. Force was out of the question. Artifice was the only resource, but the goddess of invention herself could not have told me how to begin. I felt the impossibility of working in the dark, and therefore postponed the further consideration of my schemes until I could acquire some knowledge of the internal arrangements of the hospital in which she was confined. As soon as night restored to me my liberty, I begged of Lescaut to accompany me. We were not long in drawing one of the porters into conversation. He appeared a reasonable man. I passed for a stranger, who had often, with admiration, heard talk of the hospital, and of the order that reigned within it. I inquired into the most minute details, and, proceeding from one subject to another, we at length spoke of the managers, and of these I begged to know the names and the respective characters. He gave me such information upon the latter point as at once suggested an idea which flattered my hopes, and I immediately set about carrying it into execution. I asked him, this being a matter essential to my plan, whether any of the gentlemen had children. He said he could not answer me with certainty as to all, but as for M. and Doutet, one of the principal directors, he knew that he had a son old enough to be married, and he would come several times to the hospital with his father. This was enough for my purpose. I immediately put an end to our interview, and, in returning, I told Lescaut of the plan I had formed. "I have taken it," said I, "into my head that M. de T., the son, who is rich and of good family, must have the same taste for pleasure that other young men of his age generally have. He could hardly be so bad a friend to the fair sex, nor so absurd as to refuse his services in an affair of love. I have arranged a plan for interesting him in favour of Manon. If he is a man of feeling and of right mind, he will give us his assistance from generosity. If he is not to be touched by a motive of this kind, he will at least do something for a handsome girl, if it were only with the hope of hereafter sharing her favours. I will not defer seeing him," added I, "beyond tomorrow. I really feel so elated by this project that I derive from it a good omen." Lescaut himself allowed that the idea was not unreasonable, and that we might fairly entertain a hope of turning it to account. I passed the night less sorrowfully. Next morning, I dressed as well as, in my present state of indigence, I could possibly contrive to do, and went in a hackney coach to the residence of M. de T. He was surprised at receiving a visit from a perfect stranger. I augured favourably from his countenance and the civility of his manner. I explained my object in the most candid way, and, to excite his feelings as much as possible, I spoke of my ardent passion and of Manon's merit as of two things that were unequalled, except by each other. He told me that although he had never seen Manon, he had heard of her, at least, if the person I was talking of was the same who had been the mistress of old G.M. Engineer. I conjectured that he must have heard of the part one had acted in that transaction, and in order to conciliate him more and more by treating him with confidence, I told him everything that had occurred to Manon and myself. "You see, sir," said I, "that all that can interest me in life, all that can command my affections, is in your hands. I have no reserve with you, because I have been informed of your generous and noble character, and, being of the same age, I trust I shall find some resemblance in our dispositions." He seemed flattered by this mark of candour and confidence. He replied in a manner that became a man of the world, and a man of feeling also, for they are not always synonymous terms. He told me that he appreciated my visit as a piece of good fortune, that he considered my friendship as a valuable acquisition, and that he would endeavour to prove himself worthy of it by the sincerity of his services. He could not absolutely promise to restore Manon to my arms, because, as he said, he himself had very little influence, but he offered to procure me the pleasure of seeing her, and to do everything in his power to effect her release. I was the more satisfied with this frank avowal as to his want of influence than I should have been by an unqualified promise of fulfilling all my wishes. I found in his moderation a pledge of his sincerity. In a word, I no longer doubted my entire success. The promise alone of enabling me to see Manon filled me with gratitude, and I testified it in so earnest a manner as to give him a favourable opinion of my heart and disposition. We shook hands warmly, and parted sworn friends, merely from mutual regard, and that natural feeling which prompts a man of kind and generous sentiments to esteem another of congenial mind. He, indeed, exceeded me in the proofs of his esteem, for, inferring from my adventures, and especially my late escape from St. Lazare, that I might be in want of money, he offered me his purse and pressed me to accept it. I refused, but said to him, "You are too kind, my dear sir. If in addition to such proofs of kindness and friendship, you enable me to see Manon again, rely on my eternal regard and gratitude. If you succeed in restoring altogether this dear creature to my arms, I should think myself happy in spilling the last drop of my blood in your service." Before we parted, we agreed as to the time and place for our meeting. He was so considerate as to appoint the afternoon of the same day. I waited for him at a café, where he joined me about 4 o'clock, and we went together towards the Magdalen. My knees trembled under me as I crossed the courts. "Ye heavenly powers," said I, "then I shall once more behold the idol of my heart, the dear object of so many sighs and lamentations. All I now ask of Providence is, to vouchsafe me strength enough to reach her presence, and after that, to dispose as it pleaseth of my future fate, and of my life itself. Beyond this, I have no prayer to utter." M. de T. spoke to some of the porters of the establishment, who appeared all anxious to please him. The quarter in which Manon's room lay was pointed out to us, and our guide carried in his hand the key of her chamber. It was of frightful size. I asked the man who conducted us, and whose duty it was to attend to Manon, how she passed her time. He said that she had a temper of the most angelic sweetness, that even he, disagreeable as his official duties must render him, had never heard from her a single syllable in the nature of rebuke or harshness, that her tears had never ceased to flow during the first 6 weeks after her arrival, but that latterly she seemed to bear her misfortunes with more resignation, and that she employed herself from morning till night with her needle, excepting some hours that she, each day, devoted to reading. I asked whether she had been decently provided for. He assured me that at least she had never felt the want of necessaries. We now approached her door. My heart beat almost audibly in my bosom. I said to M. de T., "Go in alone, and prepare her for my visit. I fear that she may be overcome by seeing me unexpectedly." The door was opened. I remained in the passage and listened to the conversation. He said that he came to bring her consolation, that he was a friend of mine, and felt deeply interested for the happiness of us both. She asked with the tenderest anxiety whether he could tell her what had become of me. He promised that she should soon see me at her feet, as affectionate and as faithful as ever. "When?" she asked. "This very day," said he. "The happy moment shall not be long delayed, nay, this very instant even, if you wish it." She at once understood that I was at the door. As she was rushing towards it, I entered. We embraced each other with that abounding and impassioned tenderness which an absence of many months makes so delicious to those who truly love. Our sighs, our broken exclamations, the thousand endearing appellations of love, exchanged in languishing rapture, astonished M. de T., and affected him even to tears. "I cannot help envying you," said he, as he begged us to be seated. "There is no lot, however glorious, that I would hold as comparable to the possession of a mistress at once so tender and impassioned." "Nor would I," I replied, "give up her love for universal empire." The remainder of an interview which had been so long and so ardently desired by me was of course as tender as the commencement. Poor Manon related all her adventures, and I told her mine. We bitterly wept over each other's story. M. de T. consoled us by his renewed promises to exert himself in our service. He advised us not to make this, our first interview, of too long duration, that he might have the less difficulty in procuring us the same enjoyment again. He at length induced us to follow his advice. Manon especially could not reconcile herself to the separation. She made me 100 times resume my seat. At one time she held me by my hands, at another by my coat. "Alas," she said, "in what an abode do you leave me? Who will answer for my ever seeing you again?" Mem. De T. promised her that he would often come and see her with me. "As to the abode," he said, "it must no longer be called the Magdalen. It is Versailles, now that it contains a person who deserves the empire of all hearts." I made the man who attended a present as I went out, in order to quicken his zeal and attentions. This fellow had a mind less rough and vulgar than the generality of his class. He had witnessed our interview and was affected by it. The interest he felt was doubtless increased by the louis d'or I gave him. He took me aside as we went down into the courtyard. "Sir," said he, "if you will only take me into your service, or indemnify me in any way for the loss of the situation which I fill here, I think I should not have much difficulty in liberating the beauteous Manon." I caught readily at the suggestion, and, although at the moment I was almost in a state of destitution, I gave him promises far beyond his desires. I considered that it would be at all times easy to recompense a man of his description. "Be assured, my friend," said I to him, "that there is nothing I will not be ready to do for you, and that your fortune is just as certain as my own." I inquired what means he intended to employ. "None other," said he, "than merely to open the door of her cell for her at night, and to conduct her to the street door, where you, of course, will be to receive her." I asked whether there was no danger of her being recognized as she traversed the long galleries and the courts. He admitted that there was danger, but that nothing could be done without some slight risk. Although I was delighted to find him so determined, I called M. de T. and informed him of the project and of the only difficulty in the way. He thought it not so easy of execution. He allowed the possibility of escaping thus, but if she be recognized, continued he, if she be stopped in the attempt, all hope will be over with her, perhaps for ever. Besides, you would be obliged to quit Paris instantly, for you could never evade the search that would be made for you. They would redouble their efforts as much on your own account as hers. A single man may easily escape detection, but in company with a handsome woman it would be utterly impossible to remain undiscovered. However sound this reasoning, it could not, in my mind, outweigh the immediate prospect of restoring Manon to liberty. I said as much to M. de T., and trusted that he would excuse my imprudence and rashness on the ground of love. I added that it was already my intention to quit Paris for some neighbouring village, as I had once before done. We then settled with the servant that he should carry his project into execution the following day, and to render our success as certain as he could, we resolved to carry into the prison men's clothes in order to facilitate her escape. There was a difficulty to be surmounted in carrying them in, but I had ingenuity enough to meet it. I begged of Monsieur de T. only to put on 2 light waistcoats the next morning, and I undertook to arrange the rest. We returned the following day to the hospital. I took with me linen, stockings, and so on, for Manon, and over my body coat a surtout, which concealed the bulk I carried in my pockets. We remained but a moment in her room. M. de T. left her one of his waistcoats. I gave her my short coat, the surtout being sufficient for me. She found nothing wanting for her complete equipment but a pair of pantaloons, which in my hurry I had forgotten. The want of so necessary an article might have amused us if the embarrassment it caused had been of a less serious kind. I was in despair at having our whole scheme foiled by a trifling omission of this nature. However, I soon hit on a remedy, and determined to make my own exit sans culotte, leaving that portion of my dress with Manon. My surtout was long, and I contrived by the help of a few pins to put myself in a decent condition for passing the gate. The remainder of the day appeared to me of endless length. When at last night came, we went in a coach to within a few yards of the hospital. We were not long waiting, when we saw Manon make her appearance with her guide. The door of the coach being opened, they both stepped in without delay. I opened my arms to receive my adored mistress. She trembled like an aspen leaf. The coachman asked where he was to drive. "To the end of the world," I exclaimed, "to some place where I can never again be separated from Manon." This burst, which I could not control, was near bringing me into fresh trouble. The coachman reflected upon what I said, and when I afterwards told him the name of the street to which I wished him to drive, he answered that he feared I was about to implicate him in some bad business, that he saw plainly enough that the good-looking young man, whom I called Manon, was a girl eloping from the hospital, and that he was little disposed indeed to ruin himself for love of me. Extortion was the source of this scoundrel's delicacy. We were still too near the hospital to make any noise. "Silence," said I to him, "you shall have a louis d'or for the job. For less than that he would have helped me to burn the hospital." We arrived at Lescaut's house. As it was late, Mem. De T. left us on the way, promising to visit us the next morning. The servant alone remained. I held Manon in such close embrace in my arms that we occupied but one place in the coach. She cried for joy, and I could feel her tears trickling down my cheeks. When we were about getting out at Lescaut's, I had a new difficulty with the coachman, which was attended with the most unfortunate results. I repented of having promised the fellow a louis d'or, not only because it was extravagant folly, but for another stronger reason, that it was at the moment out of my power to pay him. I called for Lescaut, and he came down to the door. I whispered to him the cause of my present embarrassment. Being naturally rough, and not at all in the habit of treating hackney coachmen with respect, he answered that I could not be serious. "A louis," said he. 20 blows of a cane would be the right payment for that rascal. I entreated him not to destroy us, when he snatched my cane from my hand and was about to lay it on the coachman. The fellow had probably before experienced the weight of a guardsman's arm, and instantly drove off, crying out that I had cheated him and should hear of him again. I in vain endeavoured to stop him. His flight caused me, of course, the greatest alarm. I had no doubt that he would immediately give information to the police. "You have ruined me," said I to Lescaut. "I shall be no longer safe at your house. We must go hence at once." I gave Manon my arm, and as quickly as possible got out of the dangerous neighbourhood. Lescaut accompanied us. The Chevalier des Grieux, having occupied more than an hour with his story, I begged him to give himself a little rest, and meanwhile to share our supper. He saw, by the attention we paid him, that we were amused, and promised that we should hear something of perhaps greater interest in the sequel. When we had finished supper, he continued in the following words. "Phi A, too, is C. How chances mock, and changes fill the cup of alteration with divers liquors, Shakespeare. How inscrutably does Providence connect events. We had hardly proceeded for 5 minutes on our way, when a man, whose face I could not see, recognized Lescaut. He had no doubt been watching for him near his home, with the horrible intention which he now unhappily executed. 'It is Lescaut,' said he, snapping a pistol at his head. 'He shall sup tonight with the angels.' He then instantly disappeared. Lescaut fell, without the least sign of life. I pressed Manon to fly, for we could be of no use to a dead man, and I feared being arrested by the police, who would certainly be soon upon the spot. I turned down the first narrow street with her and the servant. She was so overpowered by the scene she had just witnessed that I could hardly support her. At last, at the end of the street, I perceived a hackney. Coach, we got into it, but when the coachman asked whither he should drive, I was scarcely able to answer him. I had no certain asylum, no confidential friend to whom I could have recourse. I was almost destitute of money, having but $1 left in my purse. Fright and fatigue had so unnerved Manon that she was almost fainting at my side. My imagination too was full of the murder of Lescaut, and I was not without strong apprehensions of the patrol. What was to be done? I luckily remembered the inn at Chaillot, where we first went to reside in that village. I hoped to be not only secure, but to continue there for some time without being pressed for payment. "Take us to Chaillot," said I to the coachman. He refused to drive us so far at that late hour for less than 12 francs. A new embarrassment. At last we agreed for half that sum, all that my purse contained. I tried to console Manon as we went along, but despair was rankling in my own heart. I should have destroyed myself 1,000 times over if I had not felt that I held in my arms all that could attach me to life. This reflection reconciled me. "I possess her at least," said I. "She loves me. She is mine. Vainly does Tiberge call this a mere phantom of happiness." I could, without feeling interest or emotion, see the whole world besides perish around me. Why? Because I have in it no object of affection beyond her. This sentiment was true, however, while I so lightly esteemed the good things of the world. I felt that there was no doing without some little portion of them, were it only to inspire a more thorough contempt for the remainder. Love is more powerful than wealth, more attractive than grandeur or fame, but, alas, it cannot exist without certain artificial aids, and there is nothing more humiliating to the feelings of a sensitive lover than to find himself, by want of means, reduced to the level of the most vulgar minds. It was 11 o'clock when we arrived at Chaillot. They received us at the inn as old acquaintances, and expressed no sort of surprise at seeing Manon in male attire, for it was the custom in Paris and the environs to adopt all disguises. I took care to have her served with as much attention as if I had been in prosperous circumstances. She was ignorant of my poverty, and I carefully kept her so, being resolved to return alone the following day to Paris, to seek some cure for this vexatious kind of malady. At supper she appeared pale and thin. I had not observed this at the hospital, as the room in which I saw her was badly lighted. I asked her if the excessive paleness were not caused by the shock of witnessing her brother's death. She assured me that, horrified as she naturally was at the event, Her paleness was purely the effect of a 3 months' absence from me. "You do love me then devotedly?" I exclaimed. "1,000 times more than I can tell," was her reply. "You will never leave me again?" I added. "No, never, never," answered she. This assurance was confirmed by so many caresses and vows that it appeared impossible she could, to the end of time, forget them. I have never doubted that she was at that moment sincere. What motive could she have had for dissembling to such a degree? But she became afterwards still more volatile than ever, or rather she was no longer anything, and entirely forgot herself, when, in poverty and want, she saw other women living in abundance. I was now on the point of receiving a new proof of her inconstancy, which threw all that had passed into the shade, and which led to the strangest adventure that ever happened to a man of my birth and prospects. As I knew her disposition, I hastened the next day to Paris. The death of her brother, and the necessity of getting linen and clothes for her, were such good reasons that I had no occasion for any further pretext. I left the inn with the intention, as I told Manon and the landlord, of going in a hired carriage, but this was a mere flourish. Necessity obliged me to travel on foot. I walked very fast as far as Caux, Lorraine, where I intended to rest. A moment of solitude and tranquillity was requisite to compose myself and to consider what was to be done in Paris. I sat down upon the grass. I plunged into a sea of thoughts and considerations, which at length resolved themselves into 3 principal heads. I had pressing want of an infinite number of absolute necessaries. I had to seek some mode of at least raising a hope for the future, and, though last, not least in importance, I had to gain information and adopt measures to secure Manon's safety and my own. After having exhausted myself in devising projects upon these 3 chief points, I was obliged to put out of view for the moment the 2 last. We were not ill-sheltered from observation in the inn at Chaillot, and as to future wants, I thought it would be time enough to think about them when those of the moment were satisfied. The main object now was to replenish my purse. M. de T. had once offered me his, but I had an extreme repugnance to mention the subject to him again. What a degradation to expose one's misery to a stranger, and to ask for charity! It must be either a man of low mind who would thus demean himself, and that from a baseness which must render him insensible to the degradation, or a humble Christian, from a consciousness of generosity in himself, which must put him above the sense of shame. I would have sacrificed half my life to be spared the humiliation. "Tiberge," said I, "kind Tiberge, will he refuse me what he has it in his power to grant? No, he will assuredly sympathize in my misery, but he will also torture me with his lectures. One must endure his reproaches, his exhortations, his threats. I shall have to purchase his assistance so dearly that I would rather make any sacrifice than encounter this distressing scene, which cannot fail to leave me full of sorrow and remorse." Well, thought I again, all hope must be relinquished, since no other course presents itself. So far am I from adopting either of these, that I would sooner shed half my blood than face one of these evils, or the last drop rather than encounter both. Yes, the very last drop, I repeated after a moment's reflection. I would sacrifice willingly rather than submit to such base supplication. But it is not in reality a question of my existence. Manon's life and maintenance, her love and her fidelity are at stake. What consideration can outweigh that? In her are centred all my glory, happiness, and future fortune. There are doubtless many things that I would gladly give up my life to obtain, or to avoid, but to estimate a thing merely beyond the value of my own life is not putting it on a par with that of Manon. This idea soon decided me. I went on my way, resolved to go first to Tiberge and afterwards to M. de T. On entering Paris, I took a hackney coach, though I had not wherewithal to pay for it. I calculated on the loan I was going to solicit. I drove to the Luxembourg, whence I sent word to Tiberge that I was waiting for him. I had not to stay many minutes. I told him without hesitation the extremity of my wants. He asked if the £50 which I had returned to him would suffice, and he at once went to fetch it with that generous air, that pleasure in bestowing which blesseth him that gives, and him that takes, and which can only be known to love or to true friendship. Although I had never entertained a doubt of Tiberge's readiness to grant my request, yet I was surprised at having obtained it on such easy terms, that is to say, without a word of reprimand for my impenitence. But I was premature in fancying myself safe from his reproaches, for when he had counted out the money, and I was on the point of going away, he begged of me to take a walk with him in the garden. I had not mentioned Manon's name. he knew nothing of her escape, so that his lecture was merely upon my own rash flight from Saint-Lazare, and upon his apprehensions lest, instead of profiting by the lessons of morality which I had received there, I should again relapse into dissipation. He told me that having gone to pay me a visit at Saint-Lazare the day after my escape, he had been astonished beyond expression at hearing the mode in which I had effected it, that he had afterwards a conversation with the superior, that the good father had not quite recovered the shock, that he had, however, the generosity to conceal the real circumstances from the Lieutenant General of Police, and that he had prevented the death of the porter from becoming known outside the walls, that I had, therefore, upon that score, no ground for alarm, but that, if I retained one grain of prudence, I should profit by this happy turn which Providence had given to my affairs, and begin by writing to my father, and reconciling myself to his favour, and finally that, if I would be guided by his advice, I should at once quit Paris, and return to the bosom of my family. I listened to him attentively till he had finished. There was much in what he said to gratify me. In the first place, I was delighted to learn that I had nothing to fear on account of Saint-Lazare. The streets of Paris, at least, were again open to me. Then I rejoiced to find that Tiberge had no suspicion of Manon's escape and her return to my arms. I even remarked that he had not mentioned her name, probably from the idea that, by my seeming indifference to her, she had become less dear to my heart. I resolved, if not to return home, at least to write to my father, as he advised me, and to assure him that I was disposed to return to my duty and consult his wishes. My intention was to urge him to send me money for the purpose of pursuing my ordinary studies at the university, for I should have found it difficult to persuade him that I had any inclination to resume my ecclesiastical habit. I was in truth not at all averse to what I was now going to promise him. On the contrary, I was ready to apply myself to some creditable and rational pursuit, so far as the occupation would be compatible with my love. I reckoned upon being able to live with my mistress, and at the same time continuing my studies. I saw no inconsistency in this plan. These thoughts were so satisfactory to my mind that I promised Tiberge to dispatch a letter by that day's post to my father. In fact, on leaving him, I went into a scrivener's, and wrote in such a submissive and dutiful tone that, on reading over my own letter, I anticipated the triumph I was going to achieve over my father's heart. Although I had money enough to pay for a hackney coach after my interview with Tiberge, I felt a pleasure in walking independently through the streets to M. de T.'s house. There was great comfort in this unaccustomed exercise of my liberty, as to which my friend had assured me I had nothing now to apprehend. However, it suddenly occurred to me that he had been only referring to Saint-Lazare, and that I had the other affair of the hospital on my hands, being implicated, if not as an accomplice, at all events as a witness. This thought alarmed me so much that I slipped down the first narrow street and called a coach. I went at once to M. de T.'s, and he laughed at my apprehensions. I myself thought them ridiculous enough, when he informed me that there was no more danger from Lescaut's affray than from the hospital adventure. He told me that, from the fear of their suspecting that he had a hand in Manon's escape, he had gone that morning to the hospital and asked to see her, pretending not to know anything of what had happened, that they were so far from entertaining the least suspicion of either of us that they lost no time in relating the adventure as a piece of news to him, and that they wondered how so pretty a girl as Manon Lescaut could have thought of eloping with a servant, that he replied with seeming indifference that it by no means astonished him, for people would do anything for the sake of liberty. He continued to tell me how he then went to Lescaut's apartments, in the hope of finding me there with my dear mistress, that the master of the house, who was a coachmaker, protested he had seen neither me nor Manon, but that it was no wonder that we had not appeared there, if our object was to see Lescaut. For that we must have doubtless heard of his having been assassinated about the very same time, upon which he related all that he knew of the cause and circumstances of the murder. About 2 hours previously, a guardsman of Lescaut's acquaintance had come to see him, and proposed play. Lescaut had such a rapid and extravagant run of luck that in an hour the young man was minus 1,200 francs, all the money he had. Finding himself without a sou, he begged of Lescaut to lend him half the sum he had lost, and there being some difficulty on this point, an angry quarrel arose between them. Lescaut had refused to give him the required satisfaction, and the other swore on quitting him that he would take his life, a threat which he carried into execution the same night. M. de T. was kind enough to add that he had felt the utmost anxiety on our account, and that, such as they were, he should gladly continue to us his services. I at once told him the place of our retreat. He begged of me to allow him to sup with us. As I had nothing more to do than to procure the linen and clothes for Manon, I told him that we might start almost immediately, if he would be so good as to wait for me a moment while I went into 1 or 2 shops. I know not whether he suspected that I made this proposition with the view of calling his generosity into play, or whether it was by the mere impulse of a kind heart. But, having consented to start immediately, he took me to a shopkeeper who had lately furnished his house. He there made me select several articles of a much higher price than I had proposed to myself, and when I was about paying the bill, he desired the man not to take a sou from me. This he did so gracefully that I felt no shame in accepting his present. We then took the road to Chiottes together, where I arrived much more easy in mind than when I had left it that morning. Every tone and the polite attentions of M. de T.T. dispelled all Manon's melancholy. "Let us forget our past annoyances, my dear soul," said I to her, "and endeavour to live a still happier life than before. After all, there are worse masters than love. Fate cannot subject us to as much sorrow as love enables us to taste of happiness." Our supper was a true scene of joy. In possession of Manon, and of 1,250 francs, I was prouder and more contented than the richest voluptuary of Paris with untold treasures. Wealth should be measured by the means it affords us of satisfying our desires. There did not remain to me at this moment a single wish unaccomplished. Even the future gave me little concern. I felt a hope, amounting almost to certainty, that my father would allow me the means of living respectably in Paris, because I had become entitled, on entering upon my 20th year, to a share of my mother's fortune. I did not conceal from Manon what was the extent of my present wealth, but I added that it might suffice to support us until our fortune was bettered, either by the inheritance I have just alluded to, or by the resources of the hazard table. Iron. This passion hath its floods in the very times of weakness, which are great prosperity and great adversity, both which times kindle love and make it more fervent. Bacon. For several weeks I thus continued to think only of enjoying the full luxury of my situation, and being restrained, by a sense of honour, as well as a lurking apprehension of the police, from renewing my intimacy with my former companions at the Hotel of Transylvania, I began to play in certain coteries less notorious, where my good luck rendered it unnecessary for me to have recourse to my former accomplishments. I passed a part of the afternoon in town, and returned always to supper at Chilliot, accompanied very often by M. de T., whose intimacy and friendship for us daily increased. Manon soon found resources against ennui. She became acquainted with some young ladies whom the spring brought into the neighbourhood. They occupied their leisure hours in walking, and the customary amusements of persons of their sex and age. Their little gains at cards, always within innocent limits, were laid out in defraying the expense of a coach, in which they took an airing occasionally in the Bois de Boulogne, and each night when I returned, I was sure of finding Manon more beautiful, more contented, more affectionate than ever. There arose, however, certain clouds, which seemed to threaten the continuance of this blissful tranquillity, but they were soon dispelled, and Manon's sprightliness made the affair so excessively comical in its termination, that it is even now pleasing to recur to it, as a proof of the tenderness as well as the cheerfulness of her disposition. The only servant we had came to me one day with great embarrassment, and taking me aside, told me that he had a secret of the utmost importance to communicate to me. I urged him to explain himself without reserve. After some hesitation, he gave me to understand that a foreigner of high rank had apparently fallen in love with Manon. I felt my blood boil at the announcement. "Has she shown any penchant for him?" I inquired, interrupting my informant with more impatience than was requisite, if I desired to have a full explanation. He was alarmed at my excitement, and replied in an undecided tone that he had not made sufficiently minute observation to satisfy me, but that, having noticed for several days together the regular arrival of the stranger at the Bois de Boulogne, where, quitting his carriage, he walked by himself in the cross avenues, appearing to seek opportunities of meeting Manon, it had occurred to him to form an acquaintance with the servants, in order to discover the name of their master, that they spoke of him as an Italian prince, and that they also suspected he was upon some adventure of gallantry. He had not been able to learn anything further, he added, trembling as he spoke, because the prince, then on the point of leaving the wood, had approached him, and with the most condescending familiarity asked his name, upon which, as if he at once knew that he was in our service, he congratulated him on having, for his mistress, the most enchanting person upon earth. I listened to this recital with the greatest impatience. He ended with the most awkward excuses, which I attributed to the premature and imprudent display of my own agitation. In vain, I implored him to continue his history. He protested that he knew nothing more, and that what he had previously told me, having only happened the preceding day, he had not had a second opportunity of seeing the prince's servants. I encouraged him, not only with praises, but with a substantial recompense, and without betraying the slightest distrust of Manon, I requested him, in the mildest manner, to keep strict watch upon all the foreigner's movements. In truth, the effect of his fright was to leave me in a state of the cruelest suspense. It was possible that she had ordered him to suppress part of the truth. However, after a little reflection, I recovered sufficiently from my fears to see the manner in which I had exposed my weaknesses. I could hardly consider it a crime in Manon to be loved. Judging from appearances, it was probable that she was not even aware of her conquest. And what kind of life shall I in future lead, thought I, if I am capable of letting jealousy so easily take possession of my mind? I returned on the following day to Paris, with no other intention than to hasten the improvement of my fortune by playing deeper than ever, in order to be in a condition to quit Charlotte on the first real occasion for uneasiness. That night, I learned nothing at all calculated to trouble my repose. The foreigner had, as usual, made his appearance in the Bois de Boulogne, and venturing, from what had passed the preceding day, to accost my servant more familiarly, he spoke to him openly of his passion, but in such terms as not to lead to the slightest suspicion of Manon's being aware of it. He put 1,000 questions to him, and at last tried to bribe him with large promises, and taking a letter from his pocket, he in vain entreated him, with the promise of some louis d'ors, to convey it to her. 2 days passed without anything more occurring. The third was of a different character. I learned on my arrival, later than usual, from Paris, that Manon, while in the wood, had left her companions for a moment, and that the foreigner, who had followed her at a short distance, approached, upon her making him a sign, and that she handed him a letter, which he took with a transport of joy. He had only time to express his delight by kissing the billet doux, for she was out of sight in an instant. But she appeared in unusually high spirits the remainder of the day, and even after her return to our lodgings, her gaiety continued. I trembled at every word. "Are you perfectly sure," said I, in an agony of fear, to my servant, "that your eyes have not deceived you?" He called heaven to witness the truth of what he had told me. I know not to what excess the torments of my mind would have driven me, if Manon, who heard me come in, had not met me with an air of impatience, and complained of my delay. Before I had time to reply, she loaded me with caresses, and when she found we were alone, she reproached me warmly with the habit I was contracting of staying out so late. My silence gave her an opportunity of continuing, and she then said that for the last 3 weeks I had never spent one entire day in her society, that she could not endure such prolonged absence, that she should at least expect me to give up a day to her from time to time, and that she particularly wished me to be with her on the following day from morning till night. "You may be very certain I shall do that," said I, in rather a sharp tone. She did not appear to notice my annoyance. She seemed to me to have more than her usual cheerfulness, and she described with infinite pleasantry the manner in which she had spent the day. "Incomprehensible girl," said I to myself, "what am I to expect after such a prelude?" The adventures of my first separation occurred to me, nevertheless. I fancied I saw in her cheerfulness, and the affectionate reception she gave me, an air of truth that perfectly accorded with her professions. It was an easy matter at supper to account for the low spirits which I could not conceal, by attributing them to a loss I had that day sustained at the gaming table. I considered it most fortunate that the idea of my remaining all the next day at Chaillot was suggested by herself. I should thus have ample time for deliberation. My presence would prevent any fears for at least the next day, and if nothing should occur to compel me to disclose the discovery I had already made, I was determined on the following day to move my establishment into town, and fix myself in a quarter where I should have nothing to apprehend from the interference of princes. This arrangement made me pass the night more tranquilly, but it by no means put an end to the alarm I felt at the prospect of a new infidelity. When I awoke in the morning, Manon said to me that although we were to pass the day at home, she did not at all wish that I should be less carefully dressed than on other occasions, and that she had a particular fancy for doing the duties of my toilette that morning with her own hands. It was an amusement she often indulged in, but she appeared to take more pains on this occasion than I had ever observed before. To gratify her, I was obliged to sit at her toilette table, and try all the different modes she imagined for dressing my hair. In the course of the operation, she made me often turn my head round towards her, and putting both hands upon my shoulders, she would examine me with most anxious curiosity. Then, showing her approbation by 1 or 2 kisses, she would make me resume my position before the glass in order to continue her occupation. This amatory trifling engaged us till dinner time. The pleasure she seemed to derive from it, and her more than usual gaiety, appeared to me so thoroughly natural that I found it impossible any longer to suspect the treason I had previously conjured up, and I was several times on the point of candidly opening my mind to her and throwing off a load that had begun to weigh heavily upon my heart. But I flattered myself with the hope that the explanation would every moment come from herself, and I anticipated the delicious triumph this would afford me. I returned to her boudoir. She began again to put my hair in order, and I humoured all her whims when they came to say that the Princev was below and wished to see her. The name alone almost threw me into a rage. "What then?" exclaimed I, as I indignantly pushed her from me. "Who? What prince?" She made no answer to my inquiries. "Show him upstairs," said she coolly to the servant, and then turning towards me. "Dearest love, you whom I so fervently adore," she added in the most bewitching tone, "I only ask of you one moment's patience, one moment, one single moment. I will love you 10,000 times more than ever. Your compliance now shall never, during my life, be forgotten." Indignation and astonishment deprived me of the power of utterance. She renewed her entreaties, and I could not find adequate expressions to convey my feelings of anger and contempt. But hearing the door of the antechamber open, she grasped with one hand my locks, which were floating over my shoulders, while she took her toilette mirror in the other, and with all her strength led me in this manner to the door of the boudoir, which she opened with her knee, and presented to the foreigner, who had been prevented by the noise he heard inside from advancing beyond the middle of the antechamber, a spectacle that must have indeed amazed him. I saw a man extremely well dressed, but with a particularly ill-favoured countenance. Notwithstanding his embarrassment, he made her a profound bow. Manon gave him no time for speech-making. She held up the mirror before him. "Look, sir," said she to him, "observe yourself minutely, and I only ask you then to do me justice. You wish me to love you. This is the man whom I love, and whom I have sworn to love during my whole life. Make the comparison yourself. If you think you can rival him in my affections, tell me at least upon what pretensions, for I solemnly declare to you that, in the estimation of your most obedient humble servant, all the princes in Italy are not worth a single one of the hairs I now hold in my hand." During this whimsical harangue, which she had apparently prepared beforehand, I tried in vain to disengage myself, and feeling compassion for a person of such consideration, I was desirous, by my politeness at least, of making some reparation for this little outrage. But recovering his self-possession with the ease of a man accustomed to the world, he put an end to my feelings of pity by his reply, which was, in my opinion, rude enough. young lady," said he to her with a sardonic smile, "my eyes in truth are opened, and I perceive that you are much less of a novice than I had pictured to myself." He immediately retired without looking at her again, muttering to himself that the French women were quite as bad as those of Italy. I felt little desire, on this occasion, to change his opinion of the fair sex. Manon let go my hand, threw herself into an armchair, and made the room resound with her shouts of laughter. I candidly confess that I was touched most sensibly by this unexpected proof of her affection, and by the sacrifice of her own interest which I had just witnessed, and which she could only have been induced to make by her excessive love for me. Still, however, I could not help thinking she had gone rather too far. I reproached her with what I called her indiscretion. She told me that my rival, after having besieged her for several days in the Bois de Boulogne, and having made her comprehend his object by signs and grimaces, had actually made an open declaration of love, informing her at the same time of his name and all his titles by means of a letter, which he had sent through the hands of the coachman who drove her and her companions, that he had promised her, on the other side of the Alps, a brilliant fortune and eternal adoration, that she returned to Charlotte with the intention of relating to me the whole adventure, but that, fancying it might be made a source of amusement to us, she could not help gratifying her whim, that she accordingly invited the Italian prince, by a flattering note, to pay her a visit, and that it had afforded her equal delight to make me an accomplice, without giving me the least suspicion of her plan. I said not a word of the information I had received through another channel, and the intoxication of triumphant love made me applaud all she had done. 'Twas ever thus. From childhood's hour I've seen my fondest hopes decay. I never loved a tree or flower, but it was sure to fade away. I never nursed a dear gazelle to glad me with its dark blue eye, but, when it came to know me well and love me, it was sure to die. More. During my life I have remarked that fate has invariably chosen for the time of its severest visitations those moments when my fortune seemed established on the firmest basis. In the friendship of M.D.T. and the tender affections of Manon, I imagined myself so thoroughly happy that I could not harbour the slightest apprehension of any new misfortune. There was one, nevertheless, at this very period impending, which reduced me to the state in which you beheld me at Passy, and which eventually brought in its train miseries of so deplorable a nature that you will have difficulty in believing the simple recital that follows. One evening, when M.D.T. remained to sup with us, we heard the sound of a carriage stopping at the door of the inn. Curiosity tempted us to see who it was that arrived at this hour. They told us it was young G.M., the son of our most vindictive enemy, of that debauched old sinner who had incarcerated me in Saint-Lazare and Manon in the hospital. His name made the blood mount to my cheeks. "It is Providence that has led him here," said I to M.D.T., "that I may punish him for the cowardly baseness of his father. He shall not escape without our measuring swords at least." M.D.T., who knew him and was even one of his most intimate friends, tried to moderate my feelings of anger towards him. He assured me that he was a most amiable young man, and so little capable of countenancing his father's conduct that I could not be many minutes in his society without feeling esteem and affection for him. After saying many more things in his praise, he begged my permission to invite him to come and sit in our apartment, as well as to share the remainder of our supper. As to the objection of Manon being exposed by this proceeding to any danger, he pledged his honour and good faith, that when once the young man became acquainted with us, we should find in him a most zealous defender. After such an assurance, I could offer no further opposition. M.D.T. did not introduce him without delaying a few moments outside to let him know who we were. He certainly came in with an air that prepossessed us in his favour. He shook hands with me, we sat down, he admired Manon, he appeared pleased with me and with everything that belonged to us, and he ate with an appetite that did abundant honour to our hospitality. When the table was cleared, our conversation became more serious. He hung down his head while he spoke of his father's conduct towards us. He made, on his own part, the most submissive excuses. "I say the less upon the subject," said he, "because I do not wish to recall a circumstance that fills me with grief and shame." If he was sincere in the beginning, he became much more so in the end, for the conversation had not lasted half an hour when I perceived that Manon's charms had made a visible impression upon him. His looks and his manner became by degrees more tender. He, however, allowed no expression to escape him. But, without even the aid of jealousy, I had had experience enough in love affairs to discern what was passing. He remained with us till a late hour in the night, and before he took his leave, congratulated himself on having made our acquaintance, and begged permission to call and renew the offer of his services. He went off next morning with M.D.T., who accepted the offer of a seat in his carriage. I felt, as I before said, not the slightest symptom of jealousy. I had a more foolish confidence than ever in Manon's vows. This dear creature had so absolute a dominion over my whole soul and affections that I could give place to no other sentiment towards her than that of admiration and love. Far from considering it a crime that she should have pleased young Gmme, I was gratified by the effect of her charms, and experienced only a feeling of pride in being loved by a girl whom the whole world found so enchanting. I did not even deem it worth while to mention my suspicions to her. We were for some days occupied in arranging her new wardrobe, and in considering whether we might venture to the theatre without the risk of being recognized. M.D.T. came again to see us before the end of the week, and we consulted him upon this point. He saw clearly that the way to please Manon was to say yes. We resolved to go all together that same evening. We were not able, however, to carry this intention into effect, for, having taken me aside, "I have been in the greatest embarrassment," said he to me, "since I saw you, and that is the cause of my visiting you today. D.M. is in love with your mistress," he told me so in confidence. "I am his intimate friend, and disposed to do him any service in my power, but I am not less devoted to you. His designs appeared to me unjustifiable, and I expressed my disapprobation of them. I should not have divulged his secret if he had only intended to use fair and ordinary means for gaining Manon's affections. But he is aware of her capricious disposition. He has learned, God knows how, that her ruling passion is for affluence and pleasure. and, as he is already in possession of a considerable fortune, he declared his intention of tempting her at once with a present of great value, and the offer of an annuity of 6,000 francs, if I had in all other points considered you both in an equal light. I should have had, perhaps, to do more violence to my feelings in betraying him, but a sense of justice as well as of friendship was on your side, and the more so from having been myself the imprudent, though unconscious, cause of his passion in introducing him here. I feel it my duty, therefore, to avert any evil consequences from the mischief I have inadvertently caused. I thanked M. de T. for rendering me so important a service, and confessed to him, in a like spirit of confidence, that Manon's disposition was precisely what G.M. had imagined, that is to say, that she was incapable of enduring even the thought of poverty. However, said I to him, when it is a mere question of more or less, I do not believe that she would give me up for any other person. I can afford to let her want for nothing, and I have from day-to-day reason to hope that my fortune will improve. I only dread one thing, continued I, which is that G.M.M. Day may take unfair advantage of the knowledge he has of our place of residence, and bring us into trouble by disclosing it. M. de T. assured me that I might be perfectly easy upon that head, that G.M.M. might be capable of a silly passion, but not of an act of baseness, that if he ever could be villain enough for such a thing, he, de T., would be the first to punish him, and by that means make reparation for the mischief he had occasioned. I feel grateful for what you say, said I, but the mischief will have been all done, and the remedy even seems doubtful. The wisest plan, therefore, will be to quit Chaillot and go to reside elsewhere. Very true, said Emmet. De T., but you will not be able to do it quickly enough, for G.M. is to be here at noon. He told me so yesterday, and it was that intelligence that made me come so early this morning to inform you of his intentions. You may expect him every moment. The urgency of the occasion made me view this matter in a more serious light, as it seemed to me impossible to escape the visit of G.M.M., and perhaps equally so to prevent him from making his declaration to Manon. I resolved to tell her beforehand of the designs of my new rival. I fancied that when she knew I was aware of the offers that would be made to her, and made probably in my presence, she would be the more likely to reject them. I told de T. of my intention, and he observed that he thought it a matter of extreme delicacy. I admit it, said I, but no man ever had more reason for confiding in a mistress than I have for relying on the affection of mine. The only thing that could possibly for a moment blind her is the splendour of his offers. No doubt she loves her ease, but she loves me also, and in my present circumstances I cannot believe that she would abandon me for the son of the man who had incarcerated her in the Magdalen. In fine, I persisted in my intentions, and taking Manon aside, I candidly told her what I had learned. She thanked me for the good opinion I entertained of her, and promised to receive G.M.M.'s offers in a way that should prevent a repetition of them. No, said I, you must not irritate him by incivility. He has it in his power to injure us. But you know well enough, you little rogue, continued I, smiling, how to rid yourself of a disagreeable or useless lover. After a moment's pause, she said, I have just thought of an admirable plan, and I certainly have a fertile invention. G.M.M. is the son of our bitterest enemy. We must avenge ourselves on the father, not through the son's person, but through his purse. My plan is to listen to his proposals, accept his presents, and then laugh at him. The project is not a bad one, said I to her, but you forget, my dear child, that it is precisely the same course that conducted us formerly to the penitentiary. I represented to her the danger of such an enterprise, she replied, that the only thing necessary was to take our measures with caution, and she found an answer to every objection I started. Show me the lover who does not blindly humour every whim of an adored mistress, and I will then allow that I was wrong in yielding so easily on this occasion. The resolution was taken to make a dupe of G.M.M. Tam, and by an unforeseen and unlucky turn of fortune, I became the victim myself. About 11 o'clock his carriage drove up to the door. He made the most complaisant and refined speeches upon the liberty he had taken of coming to dine with us uninvited. He was not surprised at meeting Emma de Day, who had the night before promised to meet him there, and who had, under some pretext or other, refused a seat in his carriage. Although there was not a single person in the party who was not at heart meditating treachery, we all sat down with an air of mutual confidence and friendship. G.M. easily found an opportunity of declaring his sentiments to Manon. I did not wish to annoy him by appearing vigilant, so I left the room purposely for several minutes. I perceived on my return that he had not had to encounter any very discouraging austerity on Manon's part, for he was in the best possible spirits. I affected good humour also. He was laughing in his mind at my simplicity, while I was not less diverted by his own. During the whole evening we were thus supplying to each other an inexhaustible fund of amusement. I contrived, before his departure, to let him have Manon for another moment to himself, so that he had reason to applaud my complaisance as well as the hospitable reception I had given him. As soon as he got into his carriage with Mady T, Manon ran towards me with extended arms and embraced me, laughing all the while immoderately. She repeated all his speeches and proposals without altering a word. This was the substance. He of course adored her, and wished to share with her a large fortune of which he was already in possession, without counting what he was to inherit at his father's death. She should be sole mistress of his heart and fortune, and as an immediate token of his liberality, he was ready at once to supply her with an equipage, a furnished house, a lady's maid, 3 footmen, and a man, cook. "There is indeed a son," said I, "very different from his father. But tell me truly now, does not such an offer tempt you?" "Me," she replied, adapting to the idea 2 verses from Racine. "Moi, vous m'y soupçonnez de cette perfidie? Moi, je pourrais souffrir un visage odieux qui rappelle toujours l'hôpital à mes yeux? Non," replied I, continuing the parodie. "J'aurais peine à penser que l'hôpital, madame, fut un trait dont l'amour lucrave dans votre âme. But it assuredly is a temptation, a furnished house, a lady's maid, a cook, a carriage, and 3 servants. Gallantry can offer but few more seductive temptations." She protested that her heart was entirely mine, and that it was for the future only open to the impressions I chose to make upon it. "I look upon his promises," said she, "as an instrument for revenge rather than as a mark of love." I asked her if she thought of accepting the hotel and the carriage. She replied that his money was all she wanted. The difficulty was how to obtain the one without the other. We resolved to wait for a detailed explanation of the whole project in a letter which G.M.M. promised to write to her, and which in fact she received next morning by a servant out of livery, who, very cleverly, contrived an opportunity of speaking to her alone. She told him to wait for an answer, and immediately brought the letter to me. We opened it together. Passing over the usual commonplace expressions of tenderness, it gave a particular detail of my rival's promises. There were no limits to the expense. He engaged to pay her down 10,000 francs on her taking possession of the hotel, and to supply her expenditure in such a way as that she should never have less than that sum at her command. The appointed day for her entering into possession was close at hand. He only required 2 days for all his preparations, and he mentioned the name of the street and the hotel where he promised to be in waiting for her in the afternoon of the 2nd day if she could manage to escape my vigilance. That was the only point upon which he begged of her to relieve his uneasiness. He seemed to be quite satisfied upon every other, but he added that, if she apprehended any difficulty in escaping from me, he could find sure means for facilitating her flight. G.M.M. The younger was more cunning than the old gentleman. He wanted to secure his prey before he counted out the cash. We considered what course Manon should adopt. I made another effort to induce her to give up the scheme, and strongly represented all its dangers. Nothing, however, could shake her determination. Her answer to G.M.M. was brief, merely assuring him that she could be, without the least difficulty, in Paris on the appointed day, and that he might expect her with certainty. We then resolved that I should instantly hire lodgings in some village on the other side of Paris, and that I should take our luggage with me. That in the afternoon of the following day, which was the time appointed, she should go to Paris. That after receiving G.M.M.'s presents, she should earnestly entreat him to take her to the theatre. That she should carry with her as large a portion of the money as she could, and charge my servant with the remainder, for it was agreed that he was to accompany her. He was the man who had rescued her from the Magdalen, and he was devotedly attached to us. I was to be with a hackney coach at the end of the street of Saint-André-des-Arcs, and to leave it there about 7 o'clock, while I stole, under cover of the twilight, to the door of the theatre. Manon promised to make some excuse for quitting her box for a moment, when she would come down and join me. The rest could be easily done. We were then to return to my hackney coach, and quit Paris by the Faubourg Saint-Antoine, which was the road to our new residence. This plan, extravagant as it was, appeared to us satisfactorily arranged. But our greatest folly was in imagining that, succeed as we might in its execution, it would be possible for us to escape the consequences. Nevertheless, we exposed ourselves to all risk with the blindest confidence. Manon took her departure with Marcel, so was the servant called. I could not help feeling a pang as she took leave of me. "Manon," said I, "do not deceive me. Will you be faithful to me?" She complained, in the tenderest tone, of my want of confidence, and renewed all her protestations of eternal love. She was to be in Paris at 3 o'clock. I went some time after. I spent the remainder of the afternoon moping in the Café de Ferre, near the Pont Saint-Michel. I remained there till nightfall. I then hired a hackney coach, which I placed, according to our plan, at the end of the street of Saint-Mandré-des-Arcs, and went on foot to the door of the theatre. I was surprised at not seeing Marcel, who was to have been there waiting for me. I waited patiently for a full hour, standing among a crowd of lackeys and gazing at every person that passed. At length, 7 o'clock having struck, without my being able to discover anything or any person connected with our project, I procured a pit ticket in order to ascertain if Manon and G.M.M. de Bax's. Neither one nor the other could I find. I returned to the door, where I again stopped for a quarter of an hour in an agony of impatience and uneasiness. No person appeared, and I went back to the coach without knowing what to conjecture. The coachman, seeing me, advanced a few paces towards me and said, with a mysterious air, that a very handsome young person had been waiting more than an hour for me in the coach, that she described me so exactly that he could not be mistaken, and having learned that I intended to return, she said she would enter the coach and wait with patience. I felt confident that it was Manon. I approached. I beheld a very pretty face, certainly, but alas, not hers. The lady asked, in a voice that I had never before heard, whether she had the honour of speaking to the Chevalier des Grieux. I answered, "That is my name." "I have a letter for you," said she, "which will tell you what has brought me here, and by what means I learned your name." I begged she would allow me a few moments to read it in an adjoining café. She proposed to follow me, and advised me to ask for a private room, to which I consented. "Who is the writer of this letter?" I inquired. She referred me to the letter itself. I recognized Manon's hand. This is nearly the substance of the letter. G.M. had received her with a politeness and magnificence beyond anything she had previously conceived. He had loaded her with the most gorgeous presents. She had the prospect of almost imperial splendor. She assured me, however, that she could not forget me amidst all this magnificence, but that, not being able to prevail on G.M.M. to take her that evening to the play, she was obliged to defer the pleasure of seeing me, and that, as a slight consolation for the disappointment which she feared this might cause me, she had found a messenger in one of the loveliest girls in all Paris. She signed herself, "Your loving and constant Manon Lescaut." There was something so cruel and so insulting in the letter that, what between indignation and grief, I resolutely determined to forget eternally my ungrateful and perjured mistress. I looked at the young woman who stood before me. She was exceedingly pretty, and I could have wished that she had been sufficiently so to render me inconstant in my turn. But there were wanting those lovely and languishing eyes, that divine gracefulness, that exquisite complexion, in fine, those innumerable charms which nature had so profusely lavished upon the perfidious Manon. "No, no," said I, turning away from her, "the ungrateful wretch who sent you knew in her heart that she was sending you on a useless errand. Return to her, and tell her from me, to triumph in her crime, and enjoy it, if she can, without remorse. I abandon her in despair, and, at the same time, renounce all women, who, without her fascination, are no doubt her equals in baseness and infidelity." I was then on the point of going away, determined never to bestow another thought on Manon. The mortal jealousy that was racking my heart lay concealed under a dark and sullen melancholy, and I fancied under because I felt none of those violent emotions which I had experienced upon former occasions, that I had shaken off my thraldom. Alas! I was even at that moment infinitely more the dupe of love than of G.M.M. and Manon. And the girl who had brought the letter, seeing me about to depart, asked me what I wished her to say to M and G.M.M., and to the lady who was with him. At this question, I stepped back again into the room, and by one of those unaccountable transitions that are only known to the victims of violent passion, I passed in an instant from the state of subdued tranquillity which I have just described into an ungovernable fury. "Away," said I to her, "tell the traitor G.M.M. and his abandoned mistress the state of despair into which your accursed mission has cast me. But warn them that it shall not be long a source of amusement to them, and that my own hands shall be warmed with the heart's blood of both." I sank back upon a chair, my hat fell on one side and my cane upon the other, torrents of bitter tears rolled down my cheeks. The paroxysm of rage changed into a profound and silent grief. I did nothing but weep and sigh. "Approach, my child, approach," said I to the young girl. "Approach, since it is you they have sent to bring me comfort. Tell me whether you have any balm to administer for the pangs of despair and rage, any argument to offer against the crime of self-destruction which I have resolved upon after ridding the world of two perfidious monsters." "Yes, approach," continued I, perceiving that she advanced with timid and doubtful steps. "Come and dry my sorrows. Come and restore peace to my mind. Come and tell me that at least you love me, you are handsome. I may perhaps love you in return." The poor child, who was only 16 or 17 years of age, and who appeared more modest than girls of her class generally are, was thunderstruck at this unusual scene. She, however, gently approached to caress me, when with uplifted hands I rudely repulsed her. "What do you wish with me?" exclaimed I to her. "Ah, you are a woman, and of a sex I abhor and can no longer tolerate. The very gentleness of your look threatens me with some new treason. Go, leave me here alone." She made me a curtsy without uttering a word, and turned to go out. I called to her to stop. "Tell me at least," said I, "wherefore, how, with what design they sent you here? How did you discover my name, or the place where you could find me?" She told me that she had long known G.M., that he had sent for her that evening about 5 o'clock, and that, having followed the servant who had been dispatched to her, she was shown into a large house, where she found him playing at piquet with a beautiful young woman, and that they both charged her to deliver the letter into my hands. After telling her that she would find me in a hackney coach at the bottom of the street of Saint-André. I asked if they had said nothing more. She blushed while she replied that they had certainly made her believe that I should be glad of her society. "They have deceived you too," said I, "my poor girl. They have deceived you. You are a woman, and probably wish for a lover, but you must find one who is rich and happy, and it is not here you will find him. Return to M.G. Mem. He possesses everything requisite to make a man beloved. He has furnished houses and equipages to bestow, while I, who have nothing but constancy of love to offer, am despised for my poverty and laughed at for my simplicity." I continued in a tone of sorrow or violence, as these feelings alternately took possession of my mind. However, by the very excess of my agitation, I became gradually so subdued as to be able calmly to reflect upon the situation of affairs. I compared this new misfortune with those which I had already experienced of the same kind, and I could not perceive that there was any more reason for despair now than upon former occasions. I knew Manon, why then distress myself on account of a calamity which I could not but have plainly foreseen? Why not rather think of seeking a remedy? There was yet time. I at least ought not to spare my own exertions, if I wished to avoid the bitter reproach of having contributed by my own indolence to my misery. I thereupon set about considering every means of raising a gleam of hope. To attempt to take her by main force from the hands of G.M. was too desperate a project, calculated only to ruin me, and without the slightest probability of succeeding. But it seemed to me that if I could ensure a moment's interview with her, I could not fail to regain my influence over her affections. I so well knew how to excite her sensibilities. I was so confident of her love for me. The very whim even of sending me a pretty woman by way of consoling me, I would stake my existence, was her idea, and that it was the suggestion of her own sincere sympathy for my sufferings. I resolved to exert every nerve to procure an interview. After a multitude of plans which I canvassed one after another, I fixed upon the following. M. de T. had shown so much sincerity in the services he had rendered me that I could not entertain a doubt of his zeal and good faith. I proposed to call upon him at once and make him send for G.M. Nye under pretence of some important business. Half an hour would suffice to enable me to see Manon. I thought it would not be difficult to get introduced into her apartment during G.M.'s absence. This determination pacified me, and I gave a liberal present to the girl, who was still with me, and in order to prevent her from returning to those who had sent her, I took down her address and half promised to call upon her at a later hour. I then got into the hackney coach and drove quickly to M.E.A. de T. Sir. I was fortunate enough to find him at home. I had been apprehensive upon this point as I went along. A single sentence put him in possession of the whole case, as well of my sufferings, as of the friendly service I had come to supplicate at his hands. He was so astonished to learn that GMM had been able to seduce Manon from me that, not being aware that I had myself lent a hand to my own misfortune, he generously offered to assemble his friends and evoke their aid for the deliverance of my mistress. I told him that such a proceeding might by its publicity be attended with danger to Manon and to me. "Let us risk our lives," said I, "only as a last resource. My plan is of a more peaceful nature and promising at least equal success." He entered without a murmur into all that I proposed, so again stating that all I required was that he should send for GMM and contrive to keep him an hour or two from home, we at once set about our operations. We first of all considered what expedient we could make use of for keeping him out so long a time. I proposed that he should write a note dated from a cafe, begging of him to come there as soon as possible upon an affair of too urgent importance to admit of delay. "I will watch," added I, "the moment he quits the house, and introduce myself without any difficulty, being only known to Manon and my servant Marcel. You can at the same time tell GMM that the important affair upon which you wished to see him was the immediate want of a sum of money, that you had just emptied your purse at play, and that you had played on, with continued bad luck, upon credit. He will require some time to take you to his father's house, where he keeps his money, and I shall have quite sufficient for the execution of my plan." M. de T. minutely adhered to these directions. I left him in a cafe, where he at once wrote his letter. I took my station close by Manon's house. I saw de T.'s messenger arrive, and GMM come out the next moment, followed by a servant. Allowing him barely time to get out of the street, I advanced to my deceiver's door, and notwithstanding the anger I felt, I knocked with as much respect as at the portal of a church. Fortunately, it was Marcel who opened for me. Although I had nothing to apprehend from the other servants, I asked him in a low voice if he could conduct me unseen into the room in which Manon was. He said that was easily done, by merely ascending the great staircase. "Come then at once," said I to him, "and endeavour to prevent anyone from coming up while I am there." I reached the apartment without any difficulty. Manon was reading. I had there an opportunity of admiring the singular character of this girl. Instead of being nervous or alarmed at my appearance, she scarcely betrayed a symptom of surprise, which few persons, however indifferent, could restrain on seeing one whom they imagined to be far distant. "Ah, it is you, my dear love," said she, approaching to embrace me with her usual tenderness. "Good heavens, how venturesome and foolhardy you are! Who could have expected to see you in this place?" Instead of embracing her in return, I repulsed her with indignation and retreated 2 or 3 paces from her. This evidently disconcerted her. She remained immovable and fixed her eyes on me while she changed colour. I was in reality so delighted to behold her once more that, with so much real cause for anger, I could hardly bring my lips to upbraid her. My heart, however, felt the cruel outrage she had inflicted upon me. I endeavoured to revive the recollection of it in my own mind, in order to excite my feelings and put on a look of stern indignation. I remained silent for a few moments, when I remarked that she observed my agitation and trembled, apparently the effect of her fears. I could not longer endure this spectacle. "Ah, Manon," said I to her in the mildest tone, "faithless and perjured Manon, how am I to complain of your conduct? I see you pale and trembling, and I am still so much alive to your slightest sufferings that I am unwilling to add to them by my reproaches. But, Manon, I tell you that my heart is pierced with sorrow at your treatment of me, treatment that is seldom inflicted but with the purpose of destroying one's life. This is the 3rd time, Manon, I have kept a correct account. It is impossible to forget that. It is now for you to consider what course you will adopt, for my afflicted heart is no longer capable of sustaining such shocks. I know and feel that it must give way, and it is at this moment ready to burst with grief. I can say no more," added I, throwing myself into a chair. "I have hardly strength to speak or to support myself." She made me no reply, but when I was seated, she sank down upon her knees and rested her head upon my lap, covering her face with her hands. I perceived in a moment that she was shedding floods of tears. Heavens, with what conflicting sensations was I at that instant agitated! "Ah, Manon, Manon," said I, sighing, "it is too late to give me tears after the death blow you have inflicted. You affect a sorrow which you cannot feel. The greatest of your misfortunes is no doubt my presence, which has been always an obstacle to your happiness. Open your eyes, look up, and see who it is that is here. You will not throw away tears of tenderness upon an unhappy wretch whom you have betrayed and abandoned." She kissed my hands without changing her position. "Inconstant Manon," said I again, "ungrateful and faithless girl, where now are all your promises and your vows? Capricious and cruel that you are, what has now become of the love that you protested for me this very day? Just heavens," added I, "is it thus you permit a traitor to mock you, after having called you so solemnly to witness her vows? Recompense and reward, then, are for the perjured. Despair and neglect are the lot of fidelity and truth." These words conveyed even to my own mind a sentiment so bitterly severe that, in spite of myself, some tears escaped from me. Manon perceived this by the change in my voice. She at length spoke. "I must have indeed done something most culpable," said she, sobbing with grief, "to have excited and annoyed you to this degree, but I call heaven to attest my utter unconsciousness of crime and my innocence of all criminal intention." This speech struck me as so devoid of reason and of truth that I could not restrain a lively feeling of anger. "Horrible hypocrisy," cried I. "I see more plainly than ever that you are dishonest and treacherous. Now at length I learn your wretched disposition." "Adieu, base creature," said I, rising from my seat. "I would prefer death 1,000 times rather than continue to hold the slightest communication with you. May heaven punish me if I ever again waste upon you the smallest regard. Live on with your new lover, renounce all feelings of honour, detest me. Your love is now a matter to me of utter insignificance." Manon was so terrified by the violence of my anger that, remaining on her knees by the chair from which I had just before risen, breathless and trembling, she fixed her eyes upon me. I advanced a little farther towards the door, but, unless I had lost the last spark of humanity, I could not continue longer unmoved by such a spectacle. So far indeed was I from this kind of stoical indifference, that, rushing at once into the very opposite extreme, I returned, or rather flew back to her without an instant's reflection. I lifted her in my arms, I gave her 1,000 tender kisses, I implored her to pardon my ungovernable temper, I confessed that I was an absolute brute, and unworthy of being loved by such an angel. I made her sit down, and throwing myself, in my turn, upon my knees, I conjured her to listen to me in that attitude. Then I briefly expressed all that a submissive and impassioned lover could say most tender and respectful. I supplicated her pardon. She let her arms fall over my neck, as she said that it was she who stood in need of forgiveness, and begged of me in mercy to forget all the annoyances she had caused me, and that she began, with reason, to fear that I should not approve of what she had to say in her justification. "Me," said I, interrupting her impatiently, "I require no justification. I approve of all you have done. It is not for me to demand excuses for anything you do. I am but too happy, too contented, if my dear Manon will only leave me master of her affections. But," continued I, remembering that it was the crisis of my fate, "may I not, Manon, all-powerful Manon, you who wield at your pleasure my joys and sorrows, may I not be permitted, after having conciliated you by my submission and all the signs of repentance, to speak to you now of my misery and distress? May I now learn from your own lips what my destiny is to be, and whether you are resolved to sign my death warrant by spending even a single night with my rival?" She considered a moment before she replied. "My good chevalier," said she, resuming the most tranquil tone, "if you had only at first explained yourself thus distinctly, you would have spared yourself a world of trouble and prevented a scene that has really annoyed me. Since your distress is the result of jealousy, I could at first have cured that by offering to accompany you where you pleased. But I imagined it was caused by the letter which I was obliged to write in the presence of G.M.M. and of the girl whom we sent with it. I thought you might have construed that letter into a mockery, and have fancied that, by sending such a messenger, I meant to announce my abandonment of you for the sake of G.M.M. too. It was this idea that at once overwhelmed me with grief, for, innocent as I knew myself to be, I could not but allow that appearances were against me. However," continued she, "I will leave you to judge of my conduct after I shall have explained the whole truth." She then told me all that had occurred to her after joining G.M.M., whom she found punctually awaiting her arrival. He had in fact received her in the most princely style. He showed her through all the apartments, which were fitted up in the neatest and most correct taste. He had counted out to her in her boudoir 10,000 francs, as well as a quantity of jewels, amongst which were the identical pearl necklace and bracelets which she had once before received as a present from his father. He then led her into a splendid room, which she had not before seen, and in which an exquisite collation was served. She was waited upon by the new servants, whom he had hired purposely for her, and whom he now desired to consider themselves as exclusively her attendants. The carriage and the horses were afterwards paraded, and he then proposed a game of cards until supper should be announced. "I acknowledge," continued Manon, "that I was dazzled by all this magnificence. It struck me that it would be madness to sacrifice at once so many good things for the mere sake of carrying off the money and the jewels already in my possession. That it was a certain fortune made for both you and me, and that we might pass the remainder of our lives most agreeably and comfortably at the expense of GM&G. Instead of proposing the theatre, I thought it more prudent to sound his feelings with regard to you, in order to ascertain what facilities we should have for meeting in future, on the supposition that I could carry my project into effect. I found him of a most tractable disposition. He asked me how I felt towards you, and if I had not experienced some compunction at quitting you. I told him that you were so truly amiable, and had ever treated me with such undeviating kindness, that it was impossible I could hate you. He admitted that you were a man of merit, and expressed an ardent desire to gain your friendship. He was anxious to know how I thought you would take my elopement, particularly when you should learn that I was in his hands. I answered that our love was of such long standing as to have had time to moderate a little, that, besides, you were not in very easy circumstances, and would probably not consider my departure as any severe misfortune, inasmuch as it would relieve you from a burden of no very insignificant nature. I added that, being perfectly convinced you would take the whole matter rationally, I had not hesitated to tell you that I had some business in Paris, but you had at once consented, and that having accompanied me yourself, you did not seem very uneasy when we separated. If I thought, said he to me, that he could bring himself to live on good terms with me, I should be too happy to make him a tender of my services and attentions. I assured him that, from what I knew of your disposition, I had no doubt you would acknowledge his kindness in a congenial spirit, especially, I added, if he could assist you in your affairs, which had become embarrassed since your disagreement with your family. He interrupted me by declaring that he would gladly render you any service in his power, and that if you were disposed to form a new attachment, he would introduce you to an extremely pretty woman, whom he had just given up for me. I approved of all he said, she added, for fear of exciting any suspicions, and being more and more satisfied of the feasibility of my scheme, I only longed for an opportunity of letting you into it, lest you should be alarmed at my not keeping my appointment. With this view, I suggested the idea of sending this young lady to you, in order to have an opportunity of writing. I was obliged to have recourse to this plan, because I could not see a chance of his leaving me to myself for a moment. He was greatly amused with my proposition. He called his valet, and asking him whether he could immediately find his late mistress, he dispatched him at once in search of her. He imagined that she would have to go to Chaillot to meet you, but I told him that, when we parted, I promised to meet you again at the theatre, or that, if anything should prevent me from going there, you were to wait for me in a coach at the end of the street of Saint-André. That consequently it would be best to send your new love there, if it were only to save you from the misery of suspense during the whole night. I said it would be also necessary to write you a line of explanation, without which you would probably be puzzled by the whole transaction. He consented, but I was obliged to write in his presence, and I took especial care not to explain matters too palpably in my letter. This is the history, said Manon, of the entire affair. I conceal nothing from you, of either my conduct or my intentions. The girl arrived. I thought her handsome, and as I doubted not that you would be mortified by my absence, I did most sincerely hope that she would be able to dissipate something of your ennui, for it is the fidelity of the heart alone that I value. I should have been too delighted to have sent Marcel, but I could not for a single instant find an opportunity of telling him what I wished to communicate to you. She finished her story by describing the embarrassment into which M. de T's letter had thrown G.M.M. He hesitated, said she, about leaving, and assured me that he should not be long absent. And it is on this account that I am uneasy at seeing you here, and that I betrayed, at your appearance, some slight feeling of surprise. I listened to her with great patience. There were certainly parts of her recital sufficiently cruel and mortifying, for the intention at least of the infidelity was so obvious that she had not even taken the trouble to disguise it. She could never have imagined that GMM meant to venerate her as a vestal. She must therefore clearly have made up her mind to pass at least one night with him. What an avowal for a lover's ears! However, I considered myself as partly the cause of her guilt, by having been the first to let her know GMM's sentiments towards her, and by the silly readiness with which I entered into this rash project. Besides, by a natural bent of my mind, peculiar I believed to myself, I was duped by the ingenuousness of her story, by that open and winning manner with which she related even the circumstances most calculated to annoy me. There is nothing of wanton vice, said I to myself. In her transgressions she is volatile and imprudent, but she is sincere and affectionate. My love alone rendered me blind to all her faults. I was enchanted at the prospect of rescuing her that very night from my rival. I said to her, "With whom do you mean to pass the night?" She was evidently disconcerted by the question, and answered me in an embarrassed manner with buts and ifs. I felt for her, and interrupted her by saying that I at once expected her to accompany me. "Nothing can give me more pleasure," said she. "But you don't approve then of my project?" "Is it not enough," replied I, "that I approve of all that you have, up to this moment, done?" "What," said she, "are we not even to take the 10,000 francs with us?" "Why, he gave me the money, it is mine." I advised her to leave everything, and let us think only of escaping. For although I had been hardly half an hour with her, I began to dread the return of GMM. However, she so earnestly urged me to consent to our going out with something in our pockets, that I thought myself bound to make her, on my part, some concession, in return for all she yielded to me. While we were getting ready for our departure, I heard someone knock at the street door. I felt convinced that it must be GM, and in the heat of the moment I told Manon that as sure as he appeared I would take his life. In truth, I felt that I was not sufficiently recovered from my late excitement to be able to restrain my fury if I met him. Marcel put an end to my uneasiness by handing me a letter which he had received for me at the door. It was from M. de T. He told me that, as GM had gone to his father's house for the money which he wanted, he had taken advantage of his absence to communicate to me an amusing idea that had just come into his head. That it appeared to him I could not possibly take a more agreeable revenge upon my rival than by eating his supper, and spending the night in the very bed which he had hoped to share with my mistress. All this seemed to him easy enough, if I could only find 2 or 3 men upon whom I could depend, of courage sufficient to stop him in the street, and detain him in custody until next morning, that he would undertake to keep him occupied for another hour at least, under some pretext, which he could devise before GMM's return. I showed the note to Manon. I told her at the same time of the manner in which I had procured the interview with her. My scheme, as well as the new one of M. de T.'s, delighted her. We laughed heartily at it for some minutes, but when I treated it as a mere joke, I was surprised at her insisting seriously upon it, as a thing perfectly practicable and too delightful to be neglected. In vain I inquired where she thought I could possibly find, on a sudden, men fit for such an adventure, and on whom I could rely for keeping GM in strict custody. She said that I should at least try, as MMR. De T ensured us yet a full hour, and as to my other objections, she said that I was playing the tyrant, and did not show the slightest indulgence to her fancies. She said that it was impossible there could be a more enchanting project. You will have his place at supper, you will sleep in his bed, and tomorrow, as early as you like, you can walk off with both his mistress and his money. You may thus, at one blow, be amply revenged upon father and son. I yielded to her entreaties, in spite of the secret misgivings of my own mind, which seemed to forebode the unhappy catastrophe that afterwards befell me. I went out with the intention of asking 2 or 3 guardsmen, with whom Lescaut had made me acquainted, to undertake the arrest of GM&J. I found only one of them at home, but he was a fellow ripe for any adventure, and he no sooner heard our plan than he assured me of certain success. All he required was 6 pistoles to reward the 3 private soldiers whom he determined to employ in the business. I begged of him to lose no time. He got them together in less than a quarter of an hour. I waited at his lodgings till he returned with them, and then conducted him to the corner of a street through which I knew GMM must pass in going back to Manon's house. I requested him not to treat GMM roughly, but to keep him confined, and so strictly watched, until 7 o'clock next morning, that I might be free from all apprehension of his escape. He told me his intention was to bring him a prisoner to his own room, and make him undress and sleep in his bed, while he and his gallant comrades should spend the night in drinking and playing. I remained with them until we saw GM returning homewards, and I then withdrew a few steps into a dark recess in the street to enjoy so entertaining and extraordinary a scene. The officer challenged him with a pistol to his breast, and then told him in a civil tone that he did not want either his money or his life, but that if he hesitated to follow him, or if he gave the slightest alarm, he would blow his brains out. GMM, seeing that his assailant was supported by 3 soldiers, and perhaps not uninfluenced by a dread of the pistol, yielded without further resistance. I saw him led away like a lamb.